Welcome to Nocturne Historia. Empires are not born in marble halls or among golden crowns. They begin in the silence of wind over stone, in footsteps of wanderers who do not yet know they are founders. Long before names like Cyrus echoed across time, the Iranian plateau witnessed a quieter genesis, of migrants threading through mountain passes, herders coaxing life from arid soil, and scattered tribes forging unity in the crucible of survival. These were the Aryans, the noble ones, whose journey was not swift conquest but a slow settling, a fusion of earth and will. As they tamed their unforgiving homeland with ingenuity, subterranean aqueducts channeling the snowmelt of mountains into green oases, they laid the bones of a civilization that would one day challenge the known world. From this land rose two peoples, the Medes, horse warriors of the northwestern highlands, and the Persians, dryland cultivators of the south. At first they lived in the shadow of Titans, the ironclad Assyrians, the golden Lydians, the priests of Babylon. But in time, pressure forged cohesion. A prophet named Zarathustra emerged, not with armies but with questions. What is good? What is false? And what part does the soul play in this cosmic war between light and shadow? His teachings, called Zoroastrianism, introduced a radical idea, that humans could choose their path and that justice begins within. In parallel, the Medes broke free of subjugation, rising as a new empire that briefly eclipsed even Assyria. Their capital, Ecbatana, gleamed with seven-colored walls. Yet it was not they who would etch their names deepest into the stone of history, but a man born under their suzerainty, a Persian prince named Cyrus. He did not seize power with brutality, but with vision. When he overthrew the Medes, he embraced them. When he conquered Lydia, he spared its king. When he entered Babylon, he did so not as destroyer, but as liberator, allowing exiles, like the Jews, to return home and temples to rise anew. Can one build an empire not on fear, but on inclusion? Cyrus believed so. He created a system where provinces kept their languages and gods, as long as they pledged loyalty and paid tribute. Governors ruled justly under oversight. Messages raced along royal roads faster than storms. His cylinder carved in clay proclaimed a new model of kingship, one later hailed as the first charter of human rights. When he died, either on the battlefield or in peace, his tomb stood modest and enduring, stone upon stone, not gold. His son Cambyses carried the torch into Egypt, wearing the regalia of Pharaoh yet misunderstood by posterity. After him came Case, a usurper, or perhaps a brother returned. But from that uncertainty arose Darius, not born to rule, but forged to restore. He crushed rebellion not only with sword, but with order. Under his reign, the empire became a machine of astonishing complexity. Satrapies governed by law, taxes measured, roads mapped, and coins minted with imperial precision. In Persepolis, Darius built not just a palace, but a vision. Stone walls etched with faces from 23 nations, each bringing gifts, each seen and recorded. Unlike Assyrian reliefs of conquest, these images whispered harmony, not humiliation. Is unity only possible through uniformity, or can diversity be its own strength? Darius answered with administration, multilingual chancelleries, and tolerance bound by structure. Yet empires test themselves not only inwardly, but against their edges. From across the Aegean, the independent cities of Greece rose in resistance. A skirmish at Marathon shattered imperial invincibility. And so Xerxes, son of both Cyrus and Darius, by blood and vision, prepared to avenge that affront, not in anger alone, but in grandeur. He built bridges over seas, dug canals through mountains, and summoned an army of nations. But ambition does not guarantee destiny. As the Persians marched toward Thermopylae, toward Salamis, they carried not just weapons, but the weight of an imperial idea. That order could stretch from Indus to Nile, from the Oxus to the Aegean. Theirs was a world first imagined in a shepherd's migration, articulated in a prophet's prayer, and realized by rulers who asked not only what they could conquer, but what they could hold together. And when the torch passed again, from Xerxes to others, what endured was not just territory, but structure, ideology, and the belief that legitimacy rests not on fear, but on justice. The Achaemenid Empire may have faded, but in ruins and records, In roads still walked and ideas still debated, it remains a shadow across time, not of domination, but of design. History remembers Xerxes as the monarch who bridged the sea, who carved a canal through a mountain, who commanded an army of nations, but watched helplessly as winds and will unraveled his designs. On the shores of Salamis, he sat upon a golden throne and witnessed his great fleet splinter beneath waves and strategy. That moment, frozen in the imagination of centuries, has often been recast as the fall of tyranny, the triumph of freedom. Yet empires do not rise or fall in a single battle. What followed was not collapse, but recalibration. Xerxes returned east, and in the heartlands his empire endured. The grand halls of Persepolis rose higher, canal systems expanded, and the roads still pulsed with trade and tribute. Yet beneath the marble in motion, shadows gathered. The treasury drained by war, court life became a labyrinth of whispers, isolation swaddled the throne. And one night in the hush of the inner palace, the king was murdered by those closest to him. Conspiracy crowned Artaxerxes, a young prince meant to be a puppet. But puppets can cut strings. He turned on the plotters, seized true power, and ushered in a new era. The Achaemenid Empire, now tested by ambition and intrigue, turned inward. Diplomacy, gold, and subtle manipulation replaced brute conquest. Athens and Sparta bled each other in wars subtly financed by Persian silver. Control through influence. This became the art of rule. While Greeks sang odes to victory, the empire continued its quiet symphony of administration. And within this system, a deeper story unfolded, not of kings, but of peoples. From Nile to Oxus, life moved with rhythm and resilience. Farmers followed ancient floods and skies. Shepherds wandered pastures unchanged for generations. Taxes flowed like ritual, and in return, the empire gave stability. Water from qanats, roads for markets, justice administered in many tongues. Urban centers throbbed with complexity. Susa's scribes, Babylon's priests, Egyptian merchants, Phoenician sailors. Soldiers settled as citizens, marrying local women, raising families in garrisons that became cities. Tombs bear witness to cultural fusion. Greek vases beside Mesopotamian seals, Persian motifs beside Egyptian amulets. In Persepolis, tribute bearers carved in stone mirrored the real processions. Ethiopians with ivory, Indians with gold, Lydians with wool. The empire became a tapestry, its weft, power, its warp, diversity. And who stood beneath this great tent? A structured society where nobles bore bloodlines and commands, but engineers, doctors, astronomers, and scribes, drawn from many lands, wielded their own power through knowledge. Even women in a world thought ruled by men held sway. In Persia, they managed estates, ran workshops, and appeared in tablets, receiving equal pay. Queens, princesses, and mothers of kings shaped politics from behind veils of protocol. Religion, that old source of both unity and division, found unexpected harmony here. Zoroastrian fire altars burned in the heartland, yet temples to Marduk, Ammon, and even Greek gods flourished under imperial patronage. Each god, a face of the divine. Each worshiper, a thread in the fabric of order. Education flowed not through formal academies, but across temples, palaces, and workshops. A noble might learn to ride and govern. A Babylonian scribe charted stars that would guide Greek thought. Knowledge moved with merchants. Medicine from Egypt, glasswork from Phoenicia, astronomy from Mesopotamia, all crossed borders that no longer mattered. Language barriers were bridged by Aramaic clerks. Roads linked cities like arteries of reason and ritual. From Sardis to Susa, ideas traveled as surely as armies once had. And always, the unseen hand of the empire adjusted, recalibrated, endured. What is an empire, then? Is it only conquest and coin, throne and territory? Or is it the space between, where strangers learn to speak each other's tongues? Where gods sit side by side, where roads do not merely lead to power but to understanding? The Achaemenid Empire in its fullness was less a crown than a mirror that reflected both human ambition and the enduring hope that power might serve order without extinguishing difference. Empires do not truly collapse with the clash of swords or the fall of cities. They persist in the rhythm of farmers turning soil, in the quiet rituals of worship, in the slow footfalls of merchants crossing vast roads. After the thundering defeat at Salamis and the retreat from Greece, the Achaemenid Empire did not falter. It adapted. It turned its gaze inward, from conquest to cultivation, from expansion to endurance. Xerxes, though humbled, continued to build. Massive halls at Persepolis rose skyward, columns etched with lions and processions, reminding subjects not of defeat, but of order. Yet behind the splendor, cracks emerged. The court became cloistered, a world of eunuchs and whispers. Power centralized around those who controlled access rather than those who wielded vision. And in the shadows of velvet curtains, Xerxes met his end. Not on the battlefield, but in his bed, betrayed by his own. In the palace, plots outlived bloodlines. Artaxerxes I, his son, survived the same conspirators who had installed him, then purged them to claim his independence. From this turmoil, the empire did not collapse. It recalibrated. Rather than wage more ruinous wars, Persian policy shifted from force to influence. When Athens grew bold, it was Persian gold that flowed to Sparta's coffers. No longer did arrows fly, coins did. Is soft power less imperial than the sword? Or does it, in fact, run deeper? Across this immense realm, from the deserts of Egypt to the icy mountains of Bactria, life under Achaemenid rule continued with quiet regularity. Most subjects had never seen a great king, but they lived within the rhythms he maintained. Farmers measured their seasons by floods and stars. Shepherds moved with their flocks as their ancestors had for centuries. Local laws, laws, and languages remained intact, guarded by a covenant. Obey the king, pay your dues, and your world remains untouched. It was a delicate balance of tolerance and tribute. Imperial oversight was present, but seldom oppressive. In the villages, elders resolved disputes. In the cities, scribes wrote in Aramaic, merchants traded silver derricks, and governors occupied fortified residences that symbolized the reach, not the weight, of imperial authority. Urban centers flourished as hubs of culture and commerce. A soldier in a distant province might marry a local woman, build a home, raised by cultural children. Military colonies evolved into melting pots. Tombs reveal lives where Greek artistry met Babylonian ritual, where an Egyptian figurine might lie beside a Persian sword. Even in death, diversity endured. Society was layered but not rigid. Nobles, often from Persia's elite 7 families, held vast power, but competence could ascend rank. Doctors from Egypt, engineers from Ionia, astronomers from Babylon, all found roles in imperial service. Women, too, left their mark. Aristocratic ladies managed estates, led workshops, and wielded political influence through royal bloodlines. In Persepolis' clay tablets, they appear as administrators, even receiving equal rations, an ancient echo of equality. The empire's religious approach was no less remarkable. While Ahura Mazda stood as its ideological heart, the great king bowed to many gods. In Babylon, he honored Marduk. In Egypt, he wore the double crown. In Judea, he allowed the temple to rise again. Was this syncretism strategy or spiritual humility? Perhaps both. It was governance rooted in recognition. That power endures not by stamping out identity, but by weaving it into a wider pattern. Education flourished where temples taught astronomy, where scribes recorded in cuneiform and Greek thinkers absorbed Eastern knowledge. A child in Babylon might learn the stars. A courier in Lydia might ride across lands his ancestors never knew existed. Roads, stone and sand alike, connected peoples once separated by mountains, rivers, and fear. At the core of it all stood not just a king, but a concept. That unity need not mean uniformity. In this vision, the Achaemenid Empire was not a monolith, but a mosaic. Its strength lay not in sameness, but in synthesis. And though time would one day fracture its borders, the idea it forged, that diversity can be governed without destruction, still lingers like the echo of sandals on a royal road long faded beneath dust. Imagine an empire that spoke in stone and gold, whose silent sculptures and glittering vessels told stories more enduring than any scroll. The Achaemenid Empire did not merely conquer. It carved its worldview into mountains, cast it in silver, and painted it in hues now lost to time. Where others wielded fear, it wielded aesthetics. At Persepolis, the ceremonial heart of the empire, the architecture did not intimidate, it invited. A grand staircase, shallow and wide, welcomed dignitaries in solemn ascent. Above, guardians with human faces and lion bodies stood watch. Mythic Lamassu, reborn in Persian form. But it was not just scale that bespoke power, it was synthesis. Here, Egyptian precision met Mesopotamian monumentality, Anatolian motifs joined Greek sculptural finesse, and local Iranian elements bound them all. In this blend was philosophy, diversity not as threat, but as ornament. The reliefs told no tales of bloody conquest. Instead, they showed peace, delegations from 23 lands bearing gifts, not chains. Each figure was rendered with care. Fabrics with distinct weaves, faces with ethnic fidelity, gifts true to geography. They stood not as vanquished, but as participants in a shared order. What kind of empire depicts tribute as dignity, not defeat? Inside the audience hall and the treasury, this message echoed. Stone guards stood in precise formation, while inscriptions credited artisans from Babylon, Egypt, Lydia, and beyond. Even art was collaborative governance. Beyond Persepolis, the same vision spread. Provincial capitals adapted imperial forms, halls, columns, inscriptions, but shaped them to local traditions. It was not replication, but resonance. In Sardis, in Susa, and in distant Xanthos, architecture became an extension of imperial ideology, unity through variation. The Paradise Gardens, formal landscapes of water, trees, and pavilions, translated this ideal into nature. Order and beauty, water channeled with mathematical grace, symbolized dominion over chaos. These gardens would ripple across centuries, inspiring Mughal India and Moorish Spain. Artifacts tell the rest of the tale. Rhytons, drinking vessels ending in sculpted animal heads, married function with symbolism. Their curves and engravings fused Central Asian dynamism with Lydian elegance. Jewelry glittered with cross-cultural technique, Egyptian stone cutting, Anatolian granulation, and motifs of winged beasts from the steppes. Even administrative tools bore artistry. Seals depicted royal heroes grappling with monsters, myths of legitimacy pressed into clay contracts. Coins carried the image of the king as archer, weight and purity unchanging across deserts and seas, a guarantee and a symbol. Was this obsession with form vanity, or was it statecraft? In this empire, beauty was not luxury, it was language. It translated authority to those who spoke no Persian, who had never seen the king. Repetition in patterns, from textiles to bowls, whispered order, symmetry, stability. Color once brought these stones alive. Blue glazed bricks, golden fittings, hangings dyed in saffron and indigo. Music, dance, and procession animated spaces now still. These ephemeral arts, like scent in the wind, once defined courtly experience. And though time stole the pigments and silenced the liars, the bones of beauty remain. Even enemies could not resist. Greek artisans copied Persian motifs, Macedonian kings dressed in Eastern robes. The successors of Alexander borrowed Achaemenid ceremonies. Later, Parthians, Sasanians, and even Islamic dynasties echoed its gardens, its domes, its grammar of power. What does it mean when an empire's vision outlives its rule? When its walls fall, but its style endures? The Achaemenid aesthetic was not just visual, it was metaphysical, a belief that harmony was governance, that visual unity could transcend Babel's curse. Its visual language stretched across 3 continents, recognizable in Egypt, Anatolia, or the Hindu Kush. It bound diversity not with iron, but with meaning. In the end, to walk Persepolis today is not just to see ruins, it is to glimpse an ancient mind daring to imagine that justice could be beautiful, and that beauty itself could rule. Empires rarely fall in a single battle. Their ends begin slowly beneath the surface within the very stone of their foundations. The Achaemenid Empire, once a colossus of governance and grandeur, began its quiet unraveling not with invasion, but with excess, with pride gilded too thick, with whispers behind curtains. After Xerxes, the kings who followed sat deeper within their palaces, shrouded in etiquette, surrounded by eunuchs, isolated from the world they ruled. Yet outwardly, the empire still dazzled. At Susa and Persepolis, palaces rose using cedar from Lebanon, ivory from Ethiopia, lapis from Bactria. Greek sculptors carved alongside Babylonian masons. This global collaboration was not slavery, it was civilization's workshop. The empire's artisans were professionals, honored, documented, even rewarded by kings themselves. What other empire paid attention to the rations of a stonemason? And yet, while art flourished, power frayed. Satraps in far provinces grew bold, acting as kings in all but name. The central throne responded with gold and marriage alliances, but loyalty became currency, traded, not given. In Egypt, rebellion brewed. In Anatolia, satraps rebelled. To the west, Persian gold funded Sparta to weaken Athens, not through armies, but by fanning Greek rivalries. Diplomacy became the empire's sword, but could coins hold together what conviction no longer bound? At court, the royal harem expanded in size and influence. Succession became a blood sport. Brothers killed brothers. Sons plotted against fathers. And within this maelstrom, a prince named Cyrus the Younger raised an army, 10,000 Greek mercenaries, and marched on his own brother, Artaxerxes II. At Cunaxa, near Babylon, Cyrus died, and the Greeks, stranded, fought their way out, immortalized in Xenophon's Anabasis. That tale inspired future conquerors, not least a young Macedonian prince. Meanwhile, Egypt broke free. Tax revenues dwindled. Mercenaries drained the treasury. Native troops were sidelined. Provinces like Cyprus and Phoenicia swayed between loyalty and independence. At home, factionalism deepened. Artaxerxes II fathered over 100 sons. Imagine the chaos. Plots flourished like weeds. Artaxerxes III rose by slaughtering rivals. He reconquered Egypt, but at great cost. Mercenaries grew indispensable, but never truly loyal. Provincial courts became decadent replicas of the imperial one, rich in form, hollow in substance. In 338 BCE, the king was poisoned by a eunuch, replaced by a puppet. That puppet too was killed. And finally, Darius III took the throne, not by right, but by survival. It was then, as if summoned by fate, that Alexander of Macedon crossed the Hellespont. His armies were smaller, but coordinated, led with genius. At Granicus, Issus, and finally Gaugamela, the Persian forces fought, but broke. Not because they were weak, but because they were no longer unified. Darius fled east, betrayed by his own satraps, murdered before he could rise again. Alexander avenged him, not out of reverence, but to claim his mantle. He did not destroy Persepolis merely for victory, but to make a point, that he now owned what it once represented. And yet, the empire did not die entirely. Its systems, roads, languages, coinage, even the idea of ruling through diversity, were absorbed by Alexander, and after him by the Seleucids, Parthians, Sasanians, Byzantines, Mughals. It echoed in Roman administration, Islamic gardens, Chinese imperial philosophy. Is this the true mark of greatness? Not how long a dynasty lasts, but how far its vision travels. The Achaemenid Empire taught the world that unity does not require sameness, that sovereignty can be expressed in art, not just arms. Its fall was not a failure, but a transformation, an idea too vast for one crown to hold, passed on like a torch, illuminating ages to come. Great empires do not vanish. They are unmade in rituals of fire and betrayal. When Alexander crossed the Hellespont in 334 BCE, he did not merely enter Persian territory. He stepped into a world stitched together over 2 centuries by vision, diplomacy, and stone. What he faced was no crumbling relic, but a system still vast, still functioning, but fraying at the edges, wounded by internal rivalries, stretched thin by distance, and ruled by a king, Darius III, who had barely secured his throne. The battles began with near disaster. At Granicus, Alexander's life hung by a thread, saved by a comrade's blade. But superior coordination, tactical integration, and sheer audacity turned the tide. Instead of racing for the imperial heartland, he turned south, city by city, stripping the empire of its naval bases. At Gordium, he sliced through the fabled knot, declaring that destiny yields to resolve. When he met Darius at Issus, terrain trumped numbers. Alexander led a charge straight at the great king, And when Darius fled, the battle dissolved. But the true conquest was not measured in spears. It was in perception. Alexander treated the captured Persian royal family not as spoils, but with royal honors, presenting himself not as a barbarian invader, but a sovereign in waiting. Why destroy what one plans to inherit? He marched south again, not to chase Darius, but to claim legitimacy. At Tyre, he built a causeway to breach what was once thought unbreachable. At Gaza, he crushed the last imperial fortress. In Egypt, he was hailed as Pharaoh, son of gods. There, he founded Alexandria, a city meant not only to govern, but to blend worlds. At Siwa, in the sands of the western desert, the oracle called him divine. Whether truth or theater, Alexander emerged not merely as conqueror, but as myth. When he turned east once more, he moved not as a rebel king, but as a claimant to empire. At Gaugamela, the final reckoning came. Darius arrayed a massive army on open plains, but Alexander, refusing to strike by night, faced him in daylight. With precision and courage, he pierced the imperial line, forcing Darius to flee again. The center collapsed, and with it the illusion of Persian invincibility. Yet Alexander did not burn Babylon. He welcomed its satrap. He preserved Susa's treasures. He reached Persepolis, the heart of Achaemenid grandeur, and for a moment admired it. His troops took the treasury. He spared the palaces. But then, one night, the palace burned. Was it drunken impulse, revenge for Athens, or a ritual ending to an old world? In flames and ash, the era closed. And still, Darius ran. But loyalty had withered. In the eastern provinces, his own satraps turned on him. Fatally wounded by his escort, he died not in battle, but by betrayal, abandoned by those he once ruled. When Alexander found his broken body, he covered it with his own cloak and arranged a royal funeral. This was more than honor, it was inheritance. At Persepolis, he laid the empire to rest. At Pasargadae, he stood at Cyrus's tomb, and before his own death, he dressed like a Persian king, adopted Persian customs, and ruled through Persian administrators. What Alexander conquered, he became. And so ended the Achaemenid Empire, not with its annihilation, but its absorption. What survived was not a dynasty, but an idea. That rule could stretch across faiths and tongues. That power could be clothed in ceremony and beauty. The broken columns of Persepolis now rise like ribs of a fallen giant. Yet in every city that Alexander built, in every satrap that ruled under a new banner, the ghost of the empire lived on. It was never just about land, it was about how to hold it. And that lesson, written in fire and stone, remains. Empires fall, but ideas persist. When the Achaemenid world crumbled under Alexander's boots, the dust did not erase what had been built, it simply buried it under new banners. Beneath the thunder of conquest, the infrastructure of governance endured. Alexander adopted Persian dress, used Persian satraps, traveled on Persian roads, taxed with Persian systems. The empire did not vanish, it changed its voice. And when the Seleucids, Parthians, and then Romans filled the stage, they stood not in empty lands but in a theater shaped by Persian hands. But the great revival came with the Sassanids. Arising centuries later, from the very soil that bore Cyrus and Darius, they claimed not innovation but restoration. Ardashir, son of a priest, declared the return of ancient glory. With fire temples blazing, bureaucracies refined, and monumental architecture that reached toward the heavens, the Sassanid Empire consciously echoed its Achaemenid ancestors. Rock reliefs carved beside those of Persepolis proclaimed that the line of kings had not died, only slept. Under Shapur, the empire stretched from the Euphrates to the Indus, from the Caspian to the Arabian Sea. Cities like Ctesiphon and Gundeshapur blossomed into centers of art, learning, and diplomacy. But what made this empire shine was not only conquest, but continuity. Zoroastrianism became the state religion, binding diverse peoples in shared cosmology. Administrative hierarchies governed with central oversight. Silk and spices flowed through Persian hands to Roman tables. And amid this commerce, ideas traveled too: medicine, astronomy, philosophy. Refugee Greek thinkers found homes in Persian courts. Indian texts were translated into Middle Persian. Even as Christianity rose in the West, Jewish academies in Mesopotamia compiled the Babylonian Talmud under Sassanid protection. But glory attracts rivals. For centuries, Persia and Rome, later Byzantium, locked in a geopolitical dance. Borders shifted, cities fell, yet neither could claim full victory. In the early 600s, the Sassanids seemed to triumph, reclaiming Egypt, the Levant, even Anatolia. For a moment, it seemed the old empire had risen again. But this flame burned too bright. Byzantine counterattacks shattered Persian pride. Heraclius struck deep, and the great king, Khosrow II, was betrayed and executed. Chaos followed. A string of puppet rulers, exhausted armies, and fracturing provinces. This was the storm before the flood. From the Arabian desert came something unexpected. Not an empire, but a revelation. Islam surged forth not with chariots, but with conviction. And at Qadisiyah at Nahavan, the old order broke. In 651, the last Sassanid king fell. Yet the empire did not die. It dissolved into the bloodstream of a new civilization. Arabic became the language of power, but Persian remained the language of soul. Bureaucrats from Sassanid lineages ran the caliphate. Court etiquette, tax codes, postal systems, these bore Persian fingerprints. And within a century, Persian culture bloomed anew. Poets wrote in a reborn Persian tongue. Miniature painting, architecture, music, mathematics, all carried traces of Sassanid refinement. And then came Ferdowsi, whose Shahnameh, the Book of Kings, would gather the legends of Iran into a tapestry of memory more enduring than marble. Through his verses, Cyrus and Rustam lived again. Their stories alit candles in the dark, reminding a people that kingdoms fall, but identity endures. What then is the legacy of these empires? Not merely in conquests or palaces, but in the idea that rule could be just, that difference could be embraced, that power could serve purpose. The Achaemenids gave structure, the Sassanids gave soul, and together they forged a civilizational identity that survived not only foreign invasion but time itself. Today, from Istanbul to Delhi, from Samarkand to Shiraz, echoes of that world still whisper in stones, in verses, in rituals. History has many empires, but few left behind a world. Empires are often remembered by their ruins, the fallen by columns, the broken inscriptions, the faded coins. But the Achaemenid and Sassanid legacies endure not in fragments of stone, but in the structures we live by, the ideas we invoke, the identities we carry. Long after their last kings fell, their roads remained. Trade still flowed through qanats carved in ancient times, water moving silently beneath desert soil, sustaining life in the driest places. Cities like Bukhara, Kandahar, Alexandria, once nodes of imperial vision, survived conquests, regimes, and religions, retaining their pulse through the centuries. The echoes of these empires ripple through culture as well. Sassanid textile designs found their way into Byzantine robes and European fabrics. The Persian garden, divided into 4 by water channels, became the blueprint for Mughal elegance and Moorish serenity. Even the vaulted halls of Sassanid architecture transformed into the grand iwans of Islamic mosques and madrasas. But more than art or engineering, it was thought that lingered. Zoroastrian ideas of cosmic dualism, of time as a moral journey, of judgment and salvation, left their imprint on Judaism, seeped into Christianity, and helped shape Islam. Concepts like heaven and hell, the final reckoning, the battle between good and evil, these emerged in part from Iranian soil, passing through prophets and scribes, reformers, and theologians. The Persian language, born in imperial courts, spread across empires. Its vocabulary lives today in Turkish, Urdu, Armenian, even Swahili. And the use of Aramaic under Achaemenid rule helped cement it as the common tongue of the Middle East, spoken by Jesus, etched into the scripts that would birth Hebrew, Arabic, and others. Yet perhaps the most radical contribution was political. Where other empires sought to erase difference, Persia embraced it. The Achaemenids pioneered a model of governance that allowed subject peoples to retain their customs, laws, and gods. This tolerance, refined by the Sassanids, offered a vision of empire not as uniformity enforced by sword, but as harmony achieved through accommodation. It was an idea far ahead of its time, that unity does not require assimilation, that an empire can be multinational without being monolithic. And that lesson reached far. into Rome, Byzantium, the Islamic caliphates, even into modern notions of federalism and multicultural citizenship. The idea of Iran itself, beyond kings and borders, emerged through this continuity. Despite invasions and conversions, Iranians carried with them a memory of language, of landscape, of lineage. This memory allowed for revival under Islamic rule, giving birth to luminous literature, science, and philosophy. Ferdowsi's Shahnameh, composed 1,000 years after Cyrus, rekindled myths of origin and dignity, anchoring a people to their past without rejecting their present. Even today, modern Iran draws from this well. In 1905, it reclaimed the name Iran, a nod to ancient roots. And on the global stage, it often frames its identity not solely in religion or ideology, but in civilizational continuity. The Cyrus Cylinder, often called the first human rights charter, stands today in the United Nations. A replica, yes, but a reminder that ancient governance still speaks to modern aspirations. So what, in the end, did these empires leave us? Not merely palaces or armies or laws, but a model for how humans might live together across difference, how power might wear the robes of justice, how memory might survive time. The empires of ancient Iran did not vanish. They evolved, and through their evolution, they offered something rare, the possibility that even in a world of borders, a shared civilization can still bloom. Their truest legacy is not in monuments, but in the human conversation they help begin, about who we are and who we might yet become. When an empire falls, the world does not go dark. The map changes, yes. Names are replaced, coins are melted, languages shift. But underneath the rubble, something lingers, less visible than armies, more enduring than monuments. Spirit. And the spirit of ancient Iran did not die with Darius, nor with Yazdegerd, nor even with the arrival of new gods and alphabets. It moved like wind through desert stone, like water beneath the qanats, quiet, persistent, essential. Conquest alters surface, but it cannot erase ethos. What survived the collapse of the Persian empires was not a palace or a treasury. It was a way of imagining the world, a worldview in which complexity is not a threat, but a feature, where law is not an imposition, but an organizing grace, where power is not simply taken, but justified, ritually, morally, cosmically. The invaders who swept across Persia, Greeks, Arabs, Mongols, did not destroy this worldview. They absorbed it. They wore Persian robes, governed with Persian scribes, preserved Persian verse. Why? Because even in victory, they recognized something profound, that you cannot rule a land for long unless you understand the soil. And this soil remembered. It remembered justice as cosmic balance. It remembered sovereignty as stewardship. It remembered that to rule is to carry, not to crush. This is why Iran reemerged, again and again, not just politically, but civilizationally. It became Islamic, but never ceased being Persian. It became modern, but never stopped being ancient. It endured not through force, but through cultural osmosis. And what of us, the inheritors of such legacies? What do we do with the fragments handed down to us? Not golden bowls or marble halls, but values, metaphors, sensibilities. We live in a time that moves fast, forgets quickly, and trades depth for spectacle. But the Persian past is slow, deliberate, patient. It asks us not to consume history, but to commune with it, to sit with it long enough for its echoes to become questions. What does it mean to build something meant to last? How do we wield power without becoming blind to its weight? Can we find unity without demanding uniformity? These are not academic questions. They are the very architecture of human future. For in every empire's rise and fall is a parable, about hubris, about harmony, about time. And Persia's story, more than most, offers us a path not only to mourn what was lost, but to understand what remains. Its poets still speak, its gardens still bloom, its ideals still circulate, beneath flags, across borders, between faiths. You can stand in New York and see the Cyrus Cylinder, or walk in Delhi and smell saffron born of ancient Persian trade, or read a verse in Spanish that once traveled from Shiraz. This is not coincidence. It is continuity, not of nation but of imagination. So let us be worthy inheritors, not of empire but of vision, Let us not ask what Persia conquered, but what it illuminated. Let us see history not as lineage, but as a mirror, held up to remind us that all things pass, but some things persist. And in that persistence lies our truest inheritance. An empire is not merely a government, it is a grammar, a way of structuring not only laws and borders, but memory, imagination, and belonging. And so when the Persian empires fell, they did not vanish. They shifted forms. They became subtext. They became metaphor. What endures from Achaemenid and Sassanid rule is not simply architecture or administration. It is the intellectual atmosphere they created, the ambient sense that civilization must stretch itself toward order without extinguishing complexity. This is why Persia lives on not in dominance but in diffusion, in the Byzantine embrace of Zoroastrian cosmology, in the Abbasid Caliphate's adoption of Sassanid court culture, in the Renaissance rediscovery of texts translated through Persian hands, in the administrative protocols of the Ottoman Empire, in the very notion of empire as something more than conquest, as a system that must sustain difference without surrendering coherence. What did the Persians teach us? That sovereignty is not a fixed point, but a moving conversation. That loyalty can be cultivated through respect, not fear. That language, when used wisely, becomes more powerful than arms. Our Aramaic, once the imperial tongue of the Achaemenids, echoed across religions and continents. Persian, reawakened after conquest, became the cultural currency of poets, scholars, and courts from Delhi to Sarajevo. Ideas move like rivers, not in straight lines, but in curves, tributaries, and unexpected channels. And in those movements, the soul of Persia travels. Today, we often confuse civilization with spectacle, skyscrapers over scriptures, visibility over vision. But the legacy of ancient Iran is quiet, foundational, unseen. It's in the legal notion that justice must be administered impartially. It's in the ritual of ceremony as moral choreography. It's in the belief that power must always perform its legitimacy before the people. These are not just political concepts. They are civilizational postures. And they are rare. Rarer still is the ability of a civilization to teach without preaching, to inspire without dominating. Persia did this. Not always, not perfectly, but meaningfully. It did not convert the world to Zoroastrianism. It did not colonize the globe. Yet its fingerprints remain on the walls of philosophy, the grammar of tolerance, the texture of time. For in Persia, time was not only linear, it was layered. Kings ruled in cycles. Souls journeyed through trial and return. History was not a list of dates, but a field of resonance. This view matters, because in our own era, where time is flattened into immediacy, where nuance is sacrificed for noise, where memory is commodified into nostalgia, the Persian legacy reminds us to pause, to consider, to inhabit complexity. The fall of an empire is easy to mark: a battle won, a crown taken, a palace burned, but the endurance of an empire is harder to see. It lives in the shape of a prayer, in the logic of a legal code, in the silhouette of a garden, in the unspoken assumptions we carry about what it means to live well, to govern wisely, to remember rightly. So perhaps the real question is not whether Persia lives on, but how we recognize it when we see it. In a verse that honors both king and commoner, in a court that defends law over lineage, in a society that dares to hold multiplicity together without resorting to erasure. These are not accidents of history, they are echoes of empire. And we, if we are wise, will not treat them as relics. We will treat them as reminders. That greatness is not the absence of defeat, but the presence of depth. That civilization is not noise, but signal. And that in the ruins of what was, we can still build what might be. History is not a line, it is a spiral. Civilizations do not disappear, they echo. The empire of ancient Iran, long fallen in name, still breathes in the architecture of cities, in the cadence of languages, in the moral grammar of global thought. And as we peer into the mirror of the past, we do not merely remember, we reckon. The Achaemenids once ruled a world bound not by blood alone, but by ideas. That law can tame power, that difference need not divide, that legitimacy grows from justice, not fear. Today, in an age fractured by polarization, rising walls, and narrowing minds, we ask, What can an empire of 2,500 years ago still teach us? Perhaps more than we dare admit. In a time when empires are synonymous with exploitation, the legacy of Persia offers a radical alternative. Rule not as imposition, but as orchestration. The great king was not only a sovereign, he was a conductor of cultures. Languages were not silenced, but standardized. Religions were not erased, but cataloged. Traditions were not crushed, but braided into the imperial fabric. Can we imagine a world today where power respects plurality instead of fearing it, where states do not melt identities into one, but allow them to harmonize? The Persian system did not achieve utopia. It had violence, rebellion, inequality, but within its core was a principle our time must not forget. Governance is not domination, it is stewardship. The road of the empire was not just a passage for armies. It was an artery for stories, goods, and ideas. And those ideas reached far. Through Persia, the ancient Near East transmitted thought to Greece, and through Greece to Rome, and from Rome to the Enlightenment. When Jefferson studied Cyrus, he did not merely admire a king. He glimpsed the possibility of leadership rooted in restraint. And when modern diplomats cite the Cyrus cylinder, they do so not just for its ancient words, but for the modern hopes they still whisper. But this legacy is not only political, it is poetic. The Shahnameh is not a book of kings, it is a book of being. It tells us that greatness lies not only in conquest, but in character. That no ruler, no matter how mighty, escapes the judgment of time. That power fades, but memory endures. That even in defeat, dignity can shine brighter than gold. And in a time of digital chaos, algorithmic division, and cultural amnesia, perhaps this is the inheritance we need most: the courage to remember. Iran, as an idea, outlived its rulers. Through the fire of conquest and the flood of ideology, it reemerged not in palaces but in poets, not in thrones but in thought. Its endurance was never just political, it was philosophical. A civilization that asked, what is the good life? How does one rule justly? What makes a people more than a population? These questions, posed millennia ago, remain unanswered, or perhaps eternally answerable. So we must keep asking. And in doing so, we keep the empire alive, not in territory, but in truth. The columns of Persepolis still stand, not whole but upright, scorched but defiant. They are not ruins, they are reminders. That what we build, we must also mean. That power without principle is ash. That memory, if we dare hold it close, can be a compass. And that sometimes, to move forward, we must first walk back, along the ancient road where empires once rose not for glory, but for order, not for conquest, but for vision. Some legacies do not live in monuments, but in the questions they leave behind. As we walk away from the ruins of Persepolis, past the ghost of Cyrus's tomb and the echoes of Sassanid stone reliefs, we do not merely reflect on what was, we ask what might yet be. The history of Iran's ancient empires is not only a tale of conquest and collapse. It is a meditation on the architecture of power, how it is built, how it endures, and how it should be used. The Achaemenids imagined rule not as domination, but as a framework within which many voices could coexist. They asked not how to make subjects obedient, but how to make a world intelligible across tongues, tribes, and faiths. That question has never been more urgent. In a time when empires are synonymous with exploitation, the legacy of Persia offers a radical alternative: rule not as imposition, but as orchestration. The great king was not only a sovereign, he was a conductor of cultures. Languages were not silenced, but standardized. Religions were not erased, but cataloged. Traditions were not crushed, but braided into the imperial fabric. Can we imagine a world today where power respects plurality instead of fearing it? Where states do not melt identities into one, but allow them to harmonize? The Persian system did not achieve utopia. It had violence, rebellion, inequality. But within its core was a principle our time must not forget. Governance is not domination, it is stewardship. The road of the empire was not just a passage for armies, it was an artery for stories, goods, and ideas. And those ideas reached far. Through Persia, the ancient Near East transmitted thought to Greece, and through Greece to Rome, and from Rome to the Enlightenment. When Jefferson studied Cyrus, he did not merely admire a king, he glimpsed the possibility of leadership rooted in restraint. And when modern diplomats cite the Cyrus cylinder, they do so not just for its ancient words, but for the modern hopes they still whisper. But this legacy is not only political, it is poetic. The Shahnameh is not a book of kings, it is a book of being. It tells us that greatness lies not only in conquest, but in character, that no ruler, no matter how mighty, escapes the judgment of time. That power fades, but memory endures. That even in defeat, dignity can shine brighter than gold. And in a time of digital chaos, algorithmic division, and cultural amnesia, perhaps this is the inheritance we need most: the courage to remember. Iran, as an idea, outlived its rulers. Through the fire of conquest and the flood of ideology, it reemerged not in palaces but in poets, not in thrones but in thought. Its endurance was never just political, it was philosophical, a civilization that asked, what is the good life? How does one rule justly? What makes a people more than a population? These questions, posed millennia ago, remain unanswered, or perhaps eternally answerable. So we must keep asking. And in doing so, we keep the empire alive, not in territory, but in truth. The columns of Persepolis still stand, not whole, but upright, scorched, but defiant. They are not ruins, they are reminders. That what we build, we must also mean. That power without principle is ash. That memory, if we dare hold it close, can be a compass. And that sometimes, to move forward, we must first walk back, along the ancient road where empires once rose not for glory but for order, not for conquest, but for vision. History is not a map, it is a mirror. And when we gaze into the mirror of the ancient Persian empires, we do not just see kings and monuments, we see ourselves. For what is empire if not a human attempt to wrest order from chaos, to give shape to the formlessness of time, to inscribe meaning onto the shifting sands of mortality? The Achaemenids and Sassanids were not gods. They were people, flawed, ambitious, visionary. They built because they believed in structure. They governed because they feared collapse. They tolerated because they understood the limits of force. And in that complexity lies their brilliance. Today we inherit a world forged from their consequences. The notion that law must transcend ruler, that roads and language are civilizational glue, that tolerance is not weakness, but wisdom. These are not modern inventions. They are ancient survival strategies. But the empires of Persia also whisper something deeper, that no system, however vast, can endure without soul. Their ruins warn us that administration is not enough. That power without poetry, rule without ritual, leads only to erosion. And so we must ask, what makes a civilization last? Is it marble? No, marble crumbles. Is it armies? No, armies disband. Is it wealth? That too vanishes. What lasts is imagination, the belief that we belong to something larger than the moment, that there is dignity in continuity, that the dead speak through stone and song, and that the living must listen. In ancient Iran, memory was not nostalgia, it was moral infrastructure. From Zoroastrian fire temples to the verses of Ferdowsi, remembrance was sacred duty. Not to mourn, but to orient, to locate the self in the stream of time. And this, perhaps, is the true inheritance of empire, not territory, but perspective. A way of seeing the world that is layered, interconnected, circular. Not a race to dominate, but a rhythm to harmonize with. The Persians understood this. Their gardens mirrored paradise not as escape, but as blueprint. Their ceremonies did not impose, they revealed. Their tolerance was not passive, it was strategic empathy. And when they fell, they left behind not silence, but seeds. Those seeds sprouted in Islamic jurisprudence, in Renaissance philosophy, in modern governance. The rule of law, the ethics of pluralism, the aesthetics of unity, all carry the scent of Persian soil. And yet, we live in a world that forgets quickly. We live fast, consume endlessly, and rarely look back unless forced. But in doing so, we lose the very tools that could steady us. The memory of a world that once managed to govern difference, to encode beauty into law, to balance ambition with humility. The Persian past is not just Iran's, it is all of ours. a chapter in the human story where possibility was once made visible, where conquest bowed to continuity, where pride was expressed not through destruction, but through preservation, and where power was tempered by the unseen weight of legacy. So what now? Do we continue forward blind to the ground beneath us? Or do we walk with the ghosts, not to dwell but to learn? Every civilization must choose to forget or to integrate, to repeat or to evolve. Let us choose to remember, not as scholars alone, but as citizens of time. Let us carry forward not the symbols, but the sensibilities. Let the ruins be not graveyards, but guideposts. Let the names of kings be less important than the questions they posed. What is justice? What binds the many into one? What makes a ruler worthy of remembrance? The answers lie not in any one age, but in the long dialogue between them. And we are simply the next speakers. Not all ruins lie in stone. Some exist within silence. The silence of forgetting, the silence of lost wisdom, the silence we impose when we reduce history to trivia instead of truth. The empires of ancient Iran are not just stories. They are questions pressed into time. And as we stand centuries later, they do not demand admiration. They demand attention. What does it mean to remember well? To honor not only what was great, but also what was flawed, fragile, human. The Achaemenid and Sassanid worlds were not utopias. They wielded power, maintained hierarchy punished dissent. But they also imagined structures that outlived individual will. They institutionalized pluralism, engineered cooperation, and pursued governance not merely for the powerful, but for the possibility of order. In that tension lies relevance. Because the work of civilization has never been clean, it has always been a negotiation between ideals and limitations, between what we hope for and what we can hold. Today, as we drift through the flux of global uncertainty, polarization, ecological strain, technological fragmentation, the memory of these empires returns not as nostalgia, but as a reminder that human beings have faced fragmentation before, that we have in past ages dared to build vast architectures of meaning that embrace complexity, honored difference, and rooted power in continuity. The ancient Iranians did not erase what came before them. They layered upon it. Their cities were palimpsests. Their religions wove together fire and word, ritual and ethics. Their politics balanced empire with local autonomy. In their inscriptions, we see confidence, but not arrogance. And in their failures, we see ourselves. Because every generation believes it is new, that its problems are unprecedented, that its divisions are unique. But history whispers otherwise. The same questions echo. Who are we when we live together? What binds us across belief, across language, across fear? What do we owe the future? Not in wealth, but in wisdom. The empires of Iran answered not in slogans, but in systems. They did not demand sameness, they demanded service. The road, the Qanat, the archive, the court, these were not symbols of grandeur, but instruments of shared survival. And though the empires ended, their questions did not. They passed into poetry, into philosophy, into law, into the quiet rituals of descendants who no longer remembered the name of Darius, but still planted gardens in fourfold symmetry, still whispered prayers to time, still taught their children that dignity begins with order. We are those descendants. Whether we trace bloodlines or not, we are heirs to their experiment, to govern across difference, to build amidst uncertainty, to transmit values without demanding erasure. And so the question returns, will we remember deeply or shallowly? Will we mine history for slogans or for structure? Will we see in the ruins a relic or a rehearsal? For even now, new empires rise. Digital ones, ideological ones, each carrying the potential to organize or to oppress, to harmonize or to homogenize. And in choosing how we build, we choose what kind of past we wish to echo. The Persians built with stone, yes, but more enduringly, they built with thought. And thought, when rooted in memory, becomes the architecture of resilience. Let us then not study history merely to know, but to become. Let us not admire ancient wisdom from afar, but absorb it until it shapes how we see, how we serve, how we lead. Because every age in its own way stands at Persepolis, asked by the past, will you build to endure or merely to impress? Empires rise when imagination surpasses fear. They endure when principle outweighs pride, and they are remembered not for how far they reached, but for what they reached toward. The empires of ancient Iran, Chaityanas, Omhausayam, Siyahan, Achaemenid, and Sassanid alike, were not simply powers in the world. They were ideas about how the world could be shaped. Today, as we stand on the other side of millennia amidst a digital civilization both hyper-connected and deeply fragmented, we are haunted by the same questions they once asked. How shall we govern difference? How shall we transmit meaning? How shall we remember? The Achaemenids responded with a vision of empire as a mosaic, held together not by uniformity, but by proportion. The Sassanids answered with an idea of sacred kingship, where power mirrored the cosmos and was accountable to something beyond itself. Both saw the fragility of authority and built systems to distribute its weight through law, ritual, bureaucracy, culture. They knew that for power to last, it must serve something invisible, and so they built not just with stone but with story. Their ruins remain, but so do their frameworks. Their palaces crumbled, but their questions persisted. Into Islamic thought, into medieval jurisprudence, into Enlightenment reflections on tolerance and justice. It is easy to speak of ruins as past tense, but ruins are not dead. They are pauses, invitations, thresholds between what was and what remains possible. The columns of Persepolis do not mourn, they wait. They ask us what kind of world we are willing to build, and whether we understand that architecture begins in the soul. A civilization is not defined by what it conquers, but by what it refuses to abandon. The Persians never abandoned the idea that governance must be meaningful, that beauty must accompany law, that memory must be ritualized, not just recorded, that the individual soul is tethered to a cosmic order greater than any crown, and that history is not a weight to carry, but a shape to step into. In that spirit, to remember Persia is not merely to honor its greatness, it is to extend its logic, to build with care, to rule with rhythm, to resist the seduction of speed and permanence, and to plan ideas as if they will outlast us, even if we are forgotten. Because all kings are forgotten, all borders are redrawn. But what endures is sensibility, the feeling beneath the governance, the tone beneath the rule, the wisdom that whispers, you are not the beginning, you are not the center. You are the bearer of a thread older than your lifetime. This is why memory matters, not as heritage marketing, not as nostalgia, but as the moral infrastructure of continuity. To forget is to float, rootless. To remember is to be part of a rhythm. To know that others long before you wrestled with the same questions, and that their answers, if imperfect, still offer guidance. The Persians did not claim to possess truth. They curated frameworks. They cultivated possibility. And in doing so, they left us something more powerful than conquest: coherence. So as we close this journey, not as a conclusion, but as a continuation, we are invited not to worship the past, but to converse with it, to take what is useful, discard what no longer serves, and above all, to remember that we are not alone in our striving. Others came before us. They too dreamed, ruled, failed, rose again. They too looked to the stars and asked, how do we build a world worthy of memory? And their answer, etched in stone and verse and law, now rests with us. The question remains, will we listen? History is not a graveyard, it is a garden. Some flowers bloom again with each generation. Others lie dormant beneath the surface, waiting for the right season of memory. The ancient Persian empires did not simply vanish. They receded, like a tide that leaves behind not emptiness, but soil rich with salt and sediment. And in that soil, civilizations far beyond Persia found sustenance. But what allows an idea, a worldview, a cultural essence to endure while so many others vanish into silence? The answer is not stone nor steel. It is stewardship, the quiet generational act of remembering, not remembering as nostalgia, but as responsibility. For what is a civilization if not a contract across time? The Achaemenids, when they built their roads and wrote their laws, were not merely organizing space. They were organizing memory. They understood that the empire must exist in the mind as much as in the map, that unity is not imposed by force, but formed by narrative. And this is why the Persian legacy endured long after its political form collapsed. Because the idea of Iranian, of a civilization both ancient and adaptive, principled and plural, continued to live in the practices, prayers, and poetry of its people. It became an undercurrent in Islamic thought, a framework for Indo-Persian synthesis, a quiet influence on global models of multicultural governance. But more than what it gave the world, Persia offers us a mirror. It shows us that civilizations do not fail when they fall. They fail when they forget their origins, forget their duties, forget their questions. And so the question returns to us. What do we owe the past? To study it? Perhaps. To preserve it? Certainly, but more deeply, to speak its language, not literally, but philosophically. To ask, as they once asked, what is the moral architecture of power? How do we construct society without collapsing soul? In a time of algorithmic chaos and vanishing attention, can we learn again how to listen, slowly, deliberately, to what the past still whispers? The ruins of Persepolis will not answer these questions, but they will ask them. They will stand as interrogations in stone. What kind of power endures? What kind of beauty survives? And what kind of memory are we willing to bear? We are not emperors, but we are inheritors, not of empires, but of echoes, not of glory, but of grammar. The way we speak of the past shapes the way we imagine the future. And if we choose to speak of Persia not as a lost kingdom, but as a living current, we may find in it more than heritage. We may find guidance. For even now, as modern empires rise in digital forms and new ideologies compete to define order, the Persian insight remains urgent. That law must be rooted in legitimacy. That culture must flow rather than freeze. That true greatness lies not in spectacle, but in coherence. Let us not be mere observers of ruins. Let us be cultivators of memory. Let us understand that to carry the past is not to be burdened, but to be entrusted. And that trust is sacred. What you remember, you keep alive. What you forget, you risk repeating. In that sense, the fate of a civilization is never sealed in battle, but in whether those who come after choose to listen. So listen to the broken columns, to the silent inscriptions, to the metaphors buried in dust. They do not ask for worship, only witness. And in bearing witness, we become part of the story, not just of what was, but of what still might be. Perhaps the greatest empire is not one that conquers land, but one that shapes time. The Persian legacy is not merely historical, it is rhythmic. It pulses through centuries, reappearing in new forms, in new tongues, in the hidden architecture of thought. But beyond dates and dynasties, it leaves us with a haunting question. What do civilizations seek when they rise? Order, permanence, meaning, or simply a mirror vast enough to see themselves reflected? The empires of ancient Iran rose with immense ambition, but their ambition was never just material. Their cities aligned with stars. Their gardens mirrored paradise. Their laws sought not only obedience, but harmony. They understood that the deepest form of control is coherence, that true power is not noise, but narrative. And when they fell, they did not vanish. They became subtext. Their methods, myths, and metaphors embedded themselves in cultures that followed, long after the crowns were gone. This is how empires truly endure, not through conquest, but through code, moral, cultural, symbolic. Today, we too build systems. Digital ones, economic ones, global networks of influence and identity. But are they civilizations? Or are they simulations of permanence, constructed without the soil of memory or the spine of principle? The Persians built slowly. They built for continuity. They planted values as if planting trees, knowing they might never sit beneath the shade. Can we say the same? In our rush for progress, have we forgotten what kind of future is worth inheriting? Can data replace depth? Can speed replace story? And can we construct anything lasting without first listening to what has already endured? The ruins of ancient Persia are not only history lessons, they are emotional documents. They tell us that all things pass, But not all things perish. A column cracked by time still stands with dignity. A name chiseled in cuneiform still speaks, if we know how to hear. And these remnants do not invite us to restore the past, but to reflect. What makes a people truly civilized? Is it their walls, their weapons, or their willingness to locate themselves in something larger than power, the sacred rhythm of continuity and care? We live in an age of acceleration, dislocation, and algorithm. But the Persian empires invite a different rhythm, deliberate, cyclical, attentive, where the seasons matter, where rituals align people with cosmos, where memory is not a burden but a compass. It is tempting to think we are modern beyond need for history, that our technologies absolve us from a tradition. But even our most advanced systems rest upon old questions. How shall we live? What shall we value? Who shall we become? These are not problems of software, they are problems of soul, and that is what the Persians understood, that civilization is not a structure, it is a stance toward beauty, toward order, toward time. We may build taller towers, we may command faster machines, but unless we build with meaning, we are only rehearsing collapse. Let us not confuse size with strength. Let us not confuse information with wisdom. The ruins of Persepolis are silent, but not mute. They say, take care with what you build, make it worthy of erosion, make it graceful in ruin, because in the end, all things fall. But some things, if built with purpose, fall upward, into legend, into lesson, into light. When an empire ends, it does not disappear. It dissolves into questions. The banners are lowered, the capitals fall silent, and the laws lose their teeth. But in that silence, something deeper begins. The end of empire is not the end of influence. It is the beginning of interpretation. And so, centuries after the last Sassanid ruler fled, the Persian spirit remained, not in crowns but in concepts, not in armies, but in architecture, language, and law. This is the true test of a civilization, not whether it can conquer, but whether it can converse, across time, through change, beneath the rubble. And the Persian legacy does exactly that. It speaks through adaptation, through its willingness to survive by evolving. Zoroastrian ideas of duality and cosmic balance echo in modern ethics. Persian notions of sovereignty reappear in Islamic governance. The aesthetics of Persian gardens influence designs from Spain to India. This is not mere influence, it is integration. Iran's ancient empires wove themselves so deeply into the cultural DNA of surrounding regions that even those who sought to erase them ended up preserving them. And this is where Persia teaches us something profound, that power is fleeting, but pattern endures. The pattern of tolerance, of legal innovation, of symbolic rule, of cultural synthesis. These patterns become pathways for future societies to walk. We do not remember the Achaemenids because they ruled. We remember them because they ruled with rhythm. We do not honor the Sassanids because they lasted. We honor them because they lasted with purpose. And in an age like ours, fractured, rushed, distracted, that purpose matters more than ever. Because civilizations fall every day, not with invasions, but with indifference, with the erosion of coherence, with the amnesia of meaning. The real danger today is not conquest by others, but collapse from within. And that collapse begins when we stop asking, what holds us together? What do we believe that transcends the moment? What truths do we carry that are not for profit or propaganda, but for posterity? The Persian empires were flawed. They made war. They imposed order. But they also imagined a model of governance that looked beyond domination. They imagined law as a language of inclusion. They imagined empire as a canvas for plurality. And they dared to encode these ideals in stone, scripture, and song, so that even in their failure, they would not be forgotten. We are not living in an empire now, but we are living in its afterlife. And in that afterlife, we must choose to bury the past or to build upon it. The difference is not academic, it is existential. Because the ruins are not just reminders of what was, they are raw materials for what might be. They ask us, can we inherit ideas without inheriting arrogance? Can we preserve depth without freezing it into dogma? Can we build new societies that remember, not replicate? This is our task, not to revive ancient forms, but to renew ancient questions, to treat history not as a museum, but as a workshop. The Persians ruled with vision, but they also failed with vision. And in both, they left us with something rare, the chance to learn, not just to admire. The stone lions no longer roar. The palaces no longer gleam, but the questions remain, waiting, not for answers, but for courage. The courage to continue the story, not with nostalgia, but with nuance. Not by imitating, but by interpreting. Not by looking back in mourning, but by looking forward with memory. To inherit is not to possess. It is to carry, to protect, to interpret. The legacy of ancient Persia is not a treasure hoarded in museums or scrolls. It is a responsibility whispered across centuries. A civilization so vast, so layered, cannot be owned. It can only be honored. And honoring it does not mean recreating palaces or reviving crowns. It means listening to the questions it dared to ask and asking them again in our own language, our own time. What is justice when difference is the rule, not the exception? What does it mean to govern when power must submit to principle? What kind of order can survive not only conquest but collapse? The Achaemenids and Sassanids did not claim to have solved these riddles, but they dared to design around them. Their empire was a framework, not a formula. It allowed the many to live together without dissolving into the one. And though it fractured, that very framework echoed across history, in Islamic tolerance, in Ottoman legal duality, in Safavid cultural synthesis, even in modern concepts of federalism and human rights. Yet this echo is fading, not because time has passed, but because we no longer pause. We mistake information for wisdom, access for understanding, speed for structure. But civilizations are not built with speed. They are cultivated through repetition, ritual, and restraint. The Persians knew this. Their gardens were not only spaces of beauty, they were philosophies rendered in soil. Their poetry was not escape, it was governance rendered in metaphor. And their ruins were not accidents, they were designs built to be seen by the future, by us. The question is, are we worthy of the design? We live in a moment saturated with images, yet starved of symbols. We have more power than ever, but less purpose. And in this dissonance, we risk becoming a civilization without soul, a system of systems, without story. The Persian empires remind us that story is not decoration, it is foundation. It is what binds law to legitimacy, diversity to dignity, power to meaning. Without story, even the strongest empire crumbles. With it, even the fallen one speaks. So what is the story we will tell of ourselves? Will we remember ancient Persia as a past too distant to matter? Or as a mirror still polished enough to reflect who we might become? Because their ruins do not ask to be mourned. They ask to be continued, not as imitation, but as invitation. To build with patience, to govern with reverence, to speak with memory, and to hold history not as a trophy, but as a teacher. In that spirit, perhaps the greatest tribute we can offer is not to visit the ruins, but to live by their questions. To walk through our world with the same seriousness about order, the same tenderness toward time, the same belief that power without meaning is simply noise. We may never build another Persepolis, but we can build something just as lasting. A way of being that honors what once was, not by freezing it, but by freeing it to evolve. The future is not waiting for another empire. It is waiting for another ethic. And maybe, just maybe, it already lies beneath our feet, in the dust of kings, in the shadow of columns, in the silence that still speaks. Every civilization leaves behind two legacies, its ruins and its rhythm. The ruins crumble. The rhythm lingers in words, in laws, in the way we imagine the possible. And so, as we stand now at the symbolic threshold of ancient Iran's memory, we must ask not what they built, but what they meant to build. The Achaemenids carved mountains not for vanity, but for continuity. The Sassanids codified power not for dominance, but for meaning. Together, their empires formed more than a political reality. They formed a philosophy in stone. That order is sacred, that governance is a moral act, that power must kneel to principle. These were not perfect empires, no such thing exists, but they were sincere in their ambition. to connect, to stabilize, to create a world that could outlast the men who won't it. In their failures, we find warnings. In their designs, we find templates. But above all, in their silence, we find echoes. Echoes that remind us every empire is temporary, but not every idea is. And it is ideas, not armies, that shape the centuries. Today, we do not live in Persepolis, but we live in its wake. The rhythms of ancient Persia pulse beneath our global structures, in the architecture of rights, in the grammar of diplomacy, in the aesthetics of harmony. Even when unacknowledged, they persist, because once a worldview is born, it does not die, it transforms. The real inheritance of empire is not territory. It is temperament, a disposition toward governance as grace, toward power as stewardship, toward time as continuity. This is what we must remember, not out of sentimentality, but out of necessity. Because the challenges we face now, climate collapse, digital fragmentation, moral confusion, are not so different from those that faced the empires of old. Chaos is eternal. Order is the work of every generation, and memory is the soil in which that order takes root. If we forget what once held us together, we will forget how to hold anything together. The Persians built with patience. They planted ideas they would not live to harvest. They believed that to roll well was not to command, but to calibrate. That to leave a legacy was not to dominate space, but to dignify time. And in this, they offer us not a model to mimic, but a rhythm to return to. So what now? What do we do with this memory? We do not replicate it, we live it. We allow its spirit to inform our institutions. We let its questions disturb our assumptions. We carry its humility into our technologies, its wisdom into our politics, its poetry into our cities. For what is a city if not a story made of stone? What is governance if not philosophy applied with courage? And what is history if not the soul's long attempt to remember itself? The past cannot guide us unless we allow it to become more than data. It must become dialogue. The Persians understood this. That is why they inscribed in languages not just for kings, but for posterity. That is why their columns stand without roofs, so that heaven is always part of the design. And that is why we return to them now, not for pride, but for purpose. The final lesson of empire is simple. Everything ends, but not everything fades. Some truths, once carved, continue to shine. Some questions, once asked, never die. And some rhythms, once heard, never leave the human ear. We are the listeners now, and it is our task not to echo blindly, but to respond with care. Not to rebuild what was, but to build anew, guided by what was once dared. Because civilization is not the past we inherit. It is the future we imagine, together across time beneath the long shadow of memory. Somewhere between myth and memory, between ruin and revival, lies a question too often ignored. What happens when we stop remembering well? Not forgetting, but remembering poorly. Reducing history to slogans. Trimming complexity into comfort. Extracting pride while discarding wisdom. The legacy of ancient Persia, like that of many lost civilizations, is not just threatened by time. It is threatened by misuse. By those who invoke it for nationalism rather than nuance. By those who brandish it as a weapon instead of receiving it as a whisper. We stand today at a strange intersection. Never before have we had such access to the past, and yet never before have we processed it so shallowly. Museums overflow, archives digitize, AI resurrects languages. But in this abundance, something essential risks being lost: the capacity to feel history, to treat it not as spectacle, but as instruction. What the Achaemenids and Sassanids leave us is not simply inspiration. It is an ethical invitation. They remind us that greatness is not measured in conquests or capitals, but in the structures of care left behind. The qanats that still irrigate dry lands, the administrative systems that outlive dynasties, the poetry that still teaches resilience in the face of fate. These are not relics, they are revelations, but they require attention. And in a world that profits from distraction, attention is a radical act. So perhaps the most powerful thing we can do with the Persian past is not to praise it, but to practice its virtues, to build with intention, to govern with scale in mind, to embrace pluralism not as challenge, but as asset. The Persians knew something we have nearly forgotten, that complexity is not chaos, it is reality. And civilization is the art of shaping that complexity into coherence without cruelty. This is why memory matters, because every age faces its own fragmentation. Ours may be digital and ideological rather than tribal or geographic, but the underlying question remains. How do we hold together what is different without destroying what makes it distinct? Persia did not answer that perfectly, but it tried. It built empires like mosaics. It preserved languages rather than silencing them. It ritualized justice rather than improvising it. And it planted these ideals so deeply that even when its cities fell, the concepts survived. We live now in the ruins of many worlds: Roman, Chinese, Mesopotamian, Egyptian, and we inherit from each. But Persia offers something rare. Not only a story of rise and fall, but a style of remembering. One that resists both romanticism and cynicism. One that says, honor but do not idolize. Preserve but do not petrify. Reinterpret but do not erase. If we can learn that, perhaps we can become more than recipients of history. We can become collaborators with it. We can extend its rhythms into new architectures. Not palaces, but policies. Not temples, but technologies. Not rituals of conquest, but rituals of connection. That is how civilizations truly endure. Not by resisting change, but by offering change something to stand on. A root system of values, a grammar of dignity, a rhythm beneath the noise. The question, then, is not whether the past still matters. The question is whether we are still listening in a way that lets it speak. Whether we allow memory to complicate our certainties. Whether we let the silence of ruins retune the speed of our days. Because remembering is not passive. It is participatory. It is choosing, each day, to inherit not just what is convenient, but what is difficult. And in that difficulty, to find direction. So as we begin this new arc, not away from Persia, but deeper into its echoes, let us ask not what they built, but what they preserved. Not what they ruled, but what they revealed. And not what they left behind, but what they dared to imagine long after their own time. That imagination now belongs to us. In every age, humanity is offered a choice: to inherit the memory of the world, or to override it with the illusion of progress. Today, that choice feels sharper than ever. We do not burn libraries, we archive them. We do not silence history, we digitize it. But what we gain in access, we risk losing in intimacy. Because memory, to matter, must be more than available. It must be alive. And aliveness requires friction, not convenience. The ancient Persians did not preserve memory in abstract. They ritualized it. They aligned their architecture with solstice and star. They encoded justice in language, myth, and law. They did not store their values, they performed them. Not as spectacle, but as survival. Because in a world without print, memory had to live in motion. And perhaps, paradoxically, their memory endures precisely because it was embodied, not extracted. Our age, by contrast, believes that to save something is to store it, that a server can hold what once required soul. But no amount of cloud storage can preserve a civilization if no one is willing to carry its meaning forward. And meaning is carried not through access, but through attention. The kind of attention that ancient Iran cultivated through poetry, geometry, ceremony, and law. Every Persian garden was a diagram of the cosmos. Every court ritual, a choreography of moral legitimacy. These were not aesthetics. They were epistemologies, ways of knowing, of remembering, of harmonizing the human with the eternal. And though the forms changed, the function endured. Zoroastrian cosmology fed into Islamic mysticism. Administrative structures were absorbed into Abbasid, Seljuk, and even Ottoman governance. Persian language became a civilizational bridge from India to the Balkans. All this was possible because memory was not hoarded, it was curated, not frozen, but interpreted. But today, we face a different rhythm, one defined not by reverence, but by rapidity. Our machines remember for us, and in doing so, they unburden us, but also unroot us. We no longer feel the weight of memory. We scroll through it, we datify it. We turn history into fragments optimized for attention, not absorption. But civilizations are not algorithms. They are slow accumulations of wisdom, trauma, and imagination. They require ritual to metabolize memory into meaning. They require tension to preserve coherence without coercion. And they require a collective willingness to be shaped by the past, not merely informed by it. The Persians knew this. That is why they built with cosmology in mind, why they elevated poetry to the level of law, why they allowed multiplicity without sacrificing identity. And that is why their legacy still breathes, not just in sites or scripts, but in the ethos they cultivated. That governance must harmonize with the unseen, that power must serve coherence, and that memory, if honored properly, becomes prophecy. So what do we do now in our moment of dissonance? We must remember differently, not by clinging to symbols, but by reclaiming the structure beneath them. Not by retreating into nostalgia, but by reactivating the rhythms that once made memory civilizational. Let us treat history not as a scroll to quote, but as a space to inhabit. Let us read the ruins not as endings, but as unfinished sentences. Let us remember that the most advanced empires often fall, not from defeat, but from forgetting what made them meaningful. And so we ask again, can we build systems that remember not just facts but values? Can we design institutions that embody memory rather than outsource it? Can we cultivate a digital world where history is not merely archived, but activated? The future of civilization may depend on our answer. And if we are wise, we will look to the ancient Persians, not for blueprints, but for balance. For they knew something we must relearn, that memory is not data, it is design. And how we design our lives, our laws, our learning, will determine whether we are merely efficient or truly enduring. History is not made by kings alone, nor by emperors, architects, or poets. It is made quietly and continually by those who remember. Not those who memorize dates, but those who carry meaning. And in that sense, every one of us is an heir to empire, not through blood, but through attention. The ruins of ancient Persia do not ask us to reconstruct their walls. They ask us to reconstruct our awareness. Because a civilization endures not when its stones stand, but when its spirit is sensed, when its rhythms are reactivated by the living. You and I are not ancient, but we are not rootless. We are links in a chain, often invisible, occasionally fragile, but always vital. The choices we make, how we treat language, how we structure time, how we respond to difference, are not personal alone. They are civilizational acts. The Achaemenids knew this. That is why they translated decrees into every tongue of the empire. Why they respected the gods of lands they conquered. Why they built roads not just for armies, but for merchants, messengers, and meaning. The Sassanids knew this too. Their rituals were not arbitrary. They were architectures of memory. Their law was not mere control. It was a choreography of justice. And their fire temples were not only places of worship, they were beacons of cosmic rhythm. All of this was held together not just by rulers, but by people. Farmers who followed the ritual calendar, scribes who preserved dialects, mothers who told stories, travelers who carried customs across mountains. These were the silent custodians of civilization. And we unknowingly inherit their task. In a time when memory is outsourced to machines, when presence is fractured by screens, when tradition is flattened into trend, perhaps our greatest responsibility is not to innovate, but to integrate, to carry forward not only tools but truths, to understand that being modern does not mean beginning from zero, that living forward must also mean remembering backward. This is not a call to nostalgia, it is a call to depth. A life lived with history is not bound, it is broadened. It means seeing yourself not as a unit, but as a conduit, not as an endpoint, but as a bridge. And in that shift, ordinary life becomes sacred. The way we speak becomes an echo of ancient grammars. The way we treat strangers becomes a reenactment of old codes. The way we gather, celebrate, mourn, build, each becomes a subtle act of remembrance. And when enough people live this way, something strange and beautiful happens. The past begins to breathe again. Not as doctrine, but as dialogue. Not as burden, but as rhythm. The Persians built with the future in mind. Their inscriptions addressed posterity. Their myths stretched across generations. Their gardens were designed to suggest eternity. And in honoring that vision, we become something more than consumers of culture. We become stewards of continuity. But continuity is not automatic. It must be chosen, rechosen, lived into. Every act of translation, every careful restoration, every ritual kept alive in the quiet of a family home. These are the real monuments of memory, more lasting than marble, more meaningful than spectacle. So the question becomes intimate. What rhythms do you carry? What ruins do you protect? What stories do you refuse to let die? In your silence, whose voice do you preserve? Because empire in its deepest sense is not land. It is legacy, not dominance, but design. And you are its latest architect. What you build may never make the news, but it will make the future. Because the past, if remembered well, does not pass. It becomes presence, and presence, when rooted in memory, becomes power, not to control, but to continue. That is how civilizations endure, through people, through you. History is not something we look back on. It is something we stand on. Beneath every step we take lies a foundation built by those who came before, laid brick by brick, with questions, hopes, and contradictions. To live without sensing that weight is not freedom, it is forgetfulness. And forgetfulness has a cost. The Persians knew this. That is why they carved law into rock, why they traced cosmology into architecture, why they designed cities to reflect both power and humility. They were not perfect, but they were intentional. They understood that civilization is not made in moments, but in patterns. And those patterns only endure when carried by people who live as if they are part of something larger than themselves. That is the real invitation of history, not to observe it, but to inhabit it. To feel the past not as a museum, but as a mandate. In our time, we are taught to be original, to innovate, to disrupt, to break from the past. And yet, the deepest innovations often come not from rebellion, but from remembering rightly. From reaching back with respect, not to replicate what was, but to continue its rhythm in a new key. The Achaemenids did not copy Babylon, they honored its systems and transformed them. The Sassanids did not erase Zoroaster, they interpreted him for their age. This is what living history looks like, a dialogue between the dead and the living. And in that dialogue, something greater than either emerges, continuity. Continuity is not repetition, it is resonance. It is the ability to take an ancient principle, like justice, order, beauty, and express it anew in the language of the present. That is what keeps civilizations from becoming relics. That is what makes memory revolutionary, because to remember deeply is to resist superficiality. To live with memory is to slow down, to listen carefully, to recognize that every tradition, every story, every ruin has something to teach, not just about the past, but about ourselves. In a world obsessed with acceleration, that kind of listening is radical. It makes us rooted, and roots, paradoxically, are what allow us to reach higher. The Persians understood this. Their gardens were rooted in geometry, but open to the sky. Their rituals grounded in earth, yet oriented toward eternity. They taught us that to be historical is not to be trapped. It is to be anchored. And from that anchor, to build forward with coherence. So what does this mean for us? It means that every decision, how we govern, how we educate, how we treat one another, is a thread in the tapestry of time. It means that our lives are not isolated sparks, but part of a longer flame. A flame passed from generation to generation, not always unbroken, not always steady, but still burning. The ruins of Persepolis do not ask us to return. They ask us to respond, to take the silence and turn it into structure, to take the dust and shape it into dignity. We do not live in ancient Iran, but the questions that shaped it remain. How do we build with purpose? How do we lead with rhythm? How do we honor complexity without collapsing into chaos? These are not Persian questions. They are human ones. And our ability to ask them again in our own way is what makes us civilized. Not technology, not wealth, but the willingness to live as if we are part of a larger memory, one that does not begin with us and will not end with us. To live historically is not to be trapped by the past. It is to become trustworthy for the future. It is to live in such a way that future generations will look back and say, they remembered, and in remembering they built. To live without history is to live without horizon. We may breathe, consume, even create, but without memory we float, unanchored, unformed. Civilization at its core is not an accumulation of things. It is a cultivation of time. And those who carry that time forward, across generations, across collapses, are not always kings or scholars. Often they are the quiet ones, the ones who preserve a word, a ritual, a sense of proportion. You may be one of them. Without realizing it, you might be part of the thread that holds the human story together. Because history is not simply behind us. It pulses through us. In every choice to honor complexity rather than erase it. In every effort to build with care instead of conquest. In every refusal to reduce life to transaction. That is the real legacy of ancient Persia, not a series of dates or monuments, but a mode of being, a belief that order is sacred, that governance must echo the cosmos, that power must be tempered by principle, and beauty must not be ornamental but structural. These ideas are not trapped in time. They are alive, waiting for someone, anyone, to carry them forward. And carrying them doesn't require scholarship. It requires orientation. A way of seeing the world not as a blank page, but as a palimpsest, layered, fragile, sacred. The Persians built with this vision. Their empires were not just territorial, they were symbolic. They believed that architecture could reflect ethics, that language could shape reality, that the garden was not just an escape, but a model for social harmony. And they embedded these beliefs not only in laws, but in lives. What remains of them today is not just what they did, but what they dared to imagine could last. And that imagination now rests with us. The future does not demand that we replicate the past. It demands that we inherit its questions, that we become worthy of the silence it leaves behind, that we learn to hear history not as noise, but as instruction, not as nostalgia, but as navigation. Because to be historical is not to live in the past, it is to live with perspective, to act today with awareness of yesterday and responsibility toward tomorrow. Most of the world today moves without that awareness. It confuses innovation with rupture. It chases acceleration without direction. But acceleration without memory is not progress. It is drift, and drift has no destination, only momentum. The Persians offer us an alternative, purpose, rhythm, a sense of time that is both cyclical and aspirational. They teach us that civilization is not built by conquering distance, but by mastering depth. And depth begins with remembrance, not the kind that hoards, but the kind that activates. That turns memory into method. That sees in the past a living resource for shaping the present. You do not need to be Persian to receive this. You only need to be human. Because the questions that shape Persepolis still shape our cities, our conflicts, our dreams. What is justice when difference is inevitable? What is greatness when power is transient? What is legacy when nothing material lasts? The answers will not come from stone. They will come from us, from how we live, build, speak, and remember, from whether we treat history as a burden or a blueprint, a weight or a wind. If we choose the latter, then even the ruins rise again, not in form but in function, not as relics but as rhythms, echoes that become foundations. And in walking with those echoes, we do not merely study civilization, we continue it. Not all intelligence is individual. Some forms of knowing belong not to persons, but to peoples. Civilizations, when they endure, do so not because they dominate, but because they learn, slowly, collectively, across centuries. This is civilizational intelligence. It is not brilliance in the moment, but coherence over time. Not the genius of a single mind, but the wisdom of accumulated memory, myth, law, and form. And few civilizations embodied this better than ancient Persia. Their greatness lay not only in the scale of what they built, but in the subtlety with which they wove meaning into structure. Their architecture reflected metaphysics. Their rituals encoded ethics. Their governance balanced diversity with dignity. And in doing so, they developed not just institutions, but intuition, a way of sensing what holds human beings together, even amid vast difference. That is civilizational intelligence, the capacity to organize life at scale without losing soul. In our era, we often confuse intelligence with information. We think faster means wiser. But speed is not structure, and data is not design. The Persians understood this. They built for duration, not for dominance. They did not rush. They tuned their cities to the cosmos, their empires to the rhythms of trade, nature, belief. They respected the local while articulating the universal. And above all, they governed with a sense of proportion between human will and cosmic order, between temporal authority and eternal principles. This proportionality is rare. It cannot be coded. It must be cultivated. And it is cultivated only through attention across generations to what works, what harms, what endures. In that sense, civilizational intelligence is a moral intelligence. It is not just about surviving, it is about justifying survival, about making a world others want to inherit. That is what the Persians tried to do, through qanats that irrigated deserts, through legal pluralism that respected difference, through poetry that preserved complexity without collapsing into confusion. They knew that culture is not decoration, it is infrastructure. And like any infrastructure, it must be maintained, carried forward. But who maintains it now? In a world fragmented by algorithm, distracted by novelty, are we still capable of such care? Do we even recognize civilizational intelligence when we see it? Or do we dismiss it as old, irrelevant, too slow for the pace of today? These questions are not rhetorical. They are urgent because we are building systems, technological, political, social, that reach across the globe but lack the wisdom to sustain coherence. We are solving problems in isolation that were meant to be held together. And in doing so, we risk becoming clever without being wise. Civilizational intelligence reminds us that wisdom is not a feature, it is a foundation. That to govern is not just to manage, but to mean. That beauty is not a luxury, it is a logic. That law, if disconnected from story and symbol, becomes brittle, and that a civilization is only as strong as the silence it honors, the pauses, the proportions, the principles that make life more than machinery. The Persians knew this, and they embedded that knowledge not just in texts, but in textures, the layout of cities, the cadence of language, the balance of power. They taught us, if we're willing to listen, that greatness is not a function of scale, but of symmetry, and that intelligence, true intelligence, is measured not by how much we know, but by how well we carry what matters. That is our task now, to carry, not everything but the essential, not perfectly but faithfully, to become not just thinkers but tenders of memory, meaning, and measure. Because the future will belong not to the most connected, but to the most coherent. And coherence is not accidental. It is an achievement, a form of intelligence older than any algorithm and wiser than any empire. Not all wisdom speaks. Some wisdom is silent. It lives in how a space is arranged, in what is not said, in the rhythm between words rather than the words themselves. Civilizational intelligence is often found not in declarations, but in design, not in speeches, but in structure. The Persians understood this. They built silence into their systems, into the pause before a judgment, into the shadow between two columns, into the symmetry of gardens that reflected not dominance over nature, but harmony within it. And in doing so, they left behind something more profound than monuments. They left behind coherence. Today, coherence is rare. We live in a time of noise, information without pattern, opinions without weight. But civilizations endure not because they are loud, but because they are layered, because they know how to build meaning that doesn't scream, but surrounds. That is the brilliance of civilizational intelligence. It weaves truth into habit, into the calendar, into the layout of a city, into the expectation that a meal shared carries more than nutrition. It carries continuity. The ancient Persians knew that culture is not just what you create, it is what you cultivate. And cultivation is slow. It requires care, repetition, and proportion. Their empires were not simply political. They were atmospheric. To live within them was to be shaped, almost invisibly, by rhythm. Festivals marking the turning of seasons, rituals marking the passage from child to adult, legal customs that balance the individual with the cosmos. All of it formed a kind of ambient wisdom, a way of being that did not need to be taught because it was lived. And this, perhaps, is what we have begun to lose. We have information but not atmosphere. We have speed but not sequence. We have access but not alignment. And so our systems become brittle, not for lack of intelligence, but for lack of integration. True civilizational intelligence integrates. It binds language to law, story to structure, ritual to rule. It does not treat governance as administration alone, but as choreography, a movement of many parts toward a shared rhythm. When that rhythm is lost, civilizations begin to fracture, not necessarily through war, but through incoherence, through the loss of invisible agreements, shared symbols, common cadences, and the result is not just dysfunction, but disconnection. The Persians guarded against this by embedding meaning in multiple layers. A single motif could reflect theology, politics, and cosmology. A poem could teach ethics and astronomy. A city could mirror the stars. This was not complexity for its own sake. It was care, a belief that human beings are more than laborers or voters or consumers, that they are meaning-seeking creatures. And that meaning must be offered at every level of life, not only in scripture, but in how streets are named, not only in myth, but in measurement, not only in theory, but in time. That is why their influence endured, because it was not shallow. It did not depend on constant assertion. It depended on subtle alignment. And subtlety, in an age of spectacle, is revolutionary. So what does this mean for us? It means that to rebuild civilizational intelligence, we must learn to see what we no longer notice. The spaces between things, the pacing of life, the moral architecture of habit. It means that we must treat culture not as content, but as context, a living system of symbols that guide how we live, think, and feel. And we must defend that context, not by resisting change, but by ensuring that change has memory. The Persians changed. They adapted. They integrated Hellenistic, Indian, and Arabic influences. But they never abandoned the principle of coherence. They bent without breaking. And in that, they teach us the most essential lesson, that survival is not the mark of civilization. Continuity is. And continuity comes not from force, but from form. From the quiet patterns that shape our loudest moments. From the spaces that make meaning possible. From the silence that still knows how to speak. There is a difference between a system that works and a civilization that means. The former is efficient, optimized, perhaps even brilliant. The latter is coherent, rooted, and dignified. One can build the tallest towers, generate the fastest data, automate the most complex processes, and still lack depth. Because intelligence alone does not make a civilization. What makes a civilization is alignment. Alignment between power and purpose, between law and wisdom, between progress and proportion. The Persians understood this in a way we are only beginning to remember. They did not build to impress. They built to express. Express balance. Express belief. Express a moral architecture that gave shape to every layer of life. Their cities did not just function. They spoke. Their rituals were not mere repetition. They were renewal. Their aesthetics were not luxury. They were logic. Everything pointed toward a kind of meaning that made survival more than just a fact. It made it a form of art. Today we live surrounded by systems, economic, technological, political. But how many of these systems are truly civilizational? How many offer a sense of rhythm, a shared story, a structure that orients the soul? We often mistake information for intelligence and intelligence for wisdom. But wisdom cannot be automated. It must be cultivated, slowly, in community, with memory, and with reverence for complexity. The Persians did not fear complexity. They organized it. They welcomed multiplicity not as threat, but as texture. Their empires encompassed many tongues, many faiths, many customs, and yet they found ways to hold it together, not by flattening difference, but by framing it within a common ethical grammar. That is civilizational intelligence, not the erasure of tension, but the choreography of tension into order. It requires leadership, yes, but also listening. It requires scale, yes, but also subtlety. And it requires a willingness to ask hard questions, not just about what we can build, but about what we should build. Are our cities designed to honor time or to consume it? Are our technologies extensions of care or only of control? Are our institutions shaped by memory or by market trends? These are not nostalgic questions. They are necessary ones, because a future without reflection is not a future. It is a momentum without meaning. And momentum, if misaligned, leads to collapse. The ruins of ancient civilizations are not warnings against ambition. They are reminders to root ambition in ethics, to embed greatness not in spectacle, but in stewardship. The Persians ruled with confidence, but also with cosmology. Their decisions were not just strategic, they were symbolic. They saw governance as a sacred responsibility, not because it was divine, but because it shaped the conditions of human flourishing. And flourishing in their worldview meant alignment with a deeper order, one that included justice, beauty, proportion, and purpose. This is what we are in danger of forgetting, that a society can be smart but soulless, that it can solve problems while creating despair, that it can optimize everything but understand nothing. Civilizational intelligence offers us a compass in this disorientation. It tells us that to build something that lasts, we must build with meaning. And meaning arises not from novelty, but from necessity. The necessity to remember, to relate, to revere. What we build today may not be carved in stone. It may exist in code, in policy, in habit. But the question remains, will it still speak when we are gone? Will it whisper coherence across centuries, as Persepolis does now? Or will it vanish in the noise of its own forgetfulness? The answer lies not in our tools, but in our attention, in how we frame the human experience, not as a race toward the new, but as a rhythm between the old and the not yet. That rhythm, if we learn to hear it, may still guide us, not backward, but inward, toward a future that thinks, feels, and remembers like a civilization worthy of its name. True intelligence does not race forward, it orients. It does not accumulate data endlessly. It knows when to pause. This is the difference between cleverness and wisdom, between efficiency and meaning, between systems that function and civilizations that flourish. Civilizational intelligence is not merely about knowing. It is about knowing what matters and acting accordingly. The Persians knew this. Their empires were not only vast, they were measured not only in miles but in meaning. Their cities were not just places of commerce, but sites of cosmic alignment. Their rituals were not distractions from life, but calibrations of it. And their governance was not an exercise in power, but in proportion. They understood that power without proportion becomes excess, and excess, left unchecked, becomes collapse. This is the wisdom we are in danger of forgetting. Today, we prize acceleration. We measure progress by speed, but speed without scale, without depth, without memory, leads not to advancement, but to erosion. Erosion of coherence, erosion of care, erosion of the very sense that life is part of a larger structure worth honoring. The Persians resisted that erosion by building slowly. They placed value not only on what worked, but on what endured. They embedded ethics into infrastructure. They made beauty a structural principle, not an afterthought. And in doing so, they taught us something subtle but essential, that civilizations are not sustained by what they can do, but by what they choose not to do, by the boundaries they place around desire, by the silence they preserve amidst noise, by the rituals that remind them of what is sacred. We, on the other hand, are forgetting how to pause. Our machines process more than we can perceive. Our cities grow faster than we can govern. Our culture moves at a pace that outstrips digestion. And in this blur, we lose more than time. We lose the ability to frame it. But framing is what civilizations do. They give form to time, shape to memory, structure to value. The Persians knew this intimately. They marked time with stories, with festivals, with structures that outlived rulers. They did not see history as a list of events, but as a landscape to be walked with reverence. And that walking, that slowness, was not stagnation. It was cultivation. They understood that to move forward well, you must first stand still long enough to understand where you are. This is what civilizational intelligence invites us to recover. Not the monuments, but the mentality. Not the artifacts, but the orientation. An orientation that knows when to build and when to rest, when to speak and when to listen, when to grow and when to guard. Because growth without restraint is not greatness, it is drift. And drift has no direction. The ruins of ancient Persia remind us not only of what was, but of what could have been preserved had we remembered how to listen. The symmetry of their gardens, the cadence of their poetry, the balance of their governance, all spoke of a civilization that dared to make wisdom a public good. Today, we treat wisdom as optional, personal, private, sometimes poetic, but rarely systemic. And yet, every system we create, economic, technological, educational, cries out for that missing ingredient, an intelligence that is moral, that knows not only how to operate, but why it should. The Persians embedded that why into everything, and that is what allowed them to influence beyond conquest. Their empire may have ended, but their example remains. And the question they pose to us is piercing. Can we design systems that are not just fast, but fair? Not just efficient, but elegant? Not just reactive, but reflective? The answer will define not only the future of governance, but the future of meaning. Because a world without civilizational intelligence may survive, but it will not know why. And a world that no longer knows why cannot last. Let us then not rush to build more, but pause to build well. Not replicate the past, but receive its rhythm. Not idolize the ruins, but inhabit their wisdom. Because the slowest truths are often the strongest, and the deepest intelligence is not loud, but lasting. A civilization without ethics is a machine with memory but no meaning. It can build, expand, innovate, but it cannot justify itself. It may survive, even dominate, but it will not endure in the deepest sense. Because endurance is not measured by duration alone, it is measured by dignity. And dignity arises not from strength, but from structure guided by principle. This is the hidden engine of every true civilization, an ethic embedded in form. The Persians understood this. Their greatness was not merely in their roads or their armies, but in their restraint. They believed that to govern was not just to control, but to carry the weight of time, of tradition, of the unseen harmony between people and cosmos. Their architecture mirrored justice. Their gardens mirrored balance. Their rituals mirrored reverence. Nothing was arbitrary. Everything pointed toward an ethic, a way of being that gave shape to power. And that ethic was not decorative, it was it was constitutive. It was what made the system human even as it scaled. In contrast, our modern systems often mistake scale for success. We build higher, connect faster, analyze deeper, but do we live better? Do we treat one another with more care, more patience, more honor? Or have we optimized the structure while hollowing the soul? These are not abstract concerns. They are existential. Because when systems grow without ethics, they lose coherence. They become noise, endless productivity without purpose. And that noise eventually collapses, not from attack, but from within. The Persians teach us that order must be moral to be meaningful. Their laws were not perfect, but they were framed within a cosmology that placed the human within a larger order, not above it. Their power was real, but it was tempered by story, by ritual, by rhythm. They saw the world not as raw material, but as a moral field. And in that field, every action mattered, not only because of its effect, but because of its alignment. This is the essence of civilizational intelligence, to build systems that remember why they exist, not just how to function, but how to serve. Not just how to grow, but how to grow rightly. And to ask again and again whether what we build still honors what we claim to value. This kind of ethic cannot be retrofitted. It must be foundational. It must be designed into the fabric of law, economy, education, and art. It must be felt in the silence of a sanctuary, in the proportions of a plaza, in the tempo of governance. The Persians placed ethic at the center, not in slogans, but in systems. They made beauty ethical and ethics beautiful. Their legacy was not only architectural, it was aspirational. They aspired to coherence, and coherence in a civilization means that values are not just preached, they are practiced through form. Today, we are drowning in information but starving for orientation. We need systems that do more than function. We need systems that guide, that shape not only what we can do, but who we become by doing it. And that shaping begins with an ethic. An answer to the oldest question of all, what kind of world is worth building and why? The ruins of Persepolis do not answer this for us. But they do remind us that others once dared to ask. And in asking, they built not just for themselves, but for the future. That future is now. And the ethic is still waiting. Not in stone, but in choice. In whether we will build for profit alone or for posterity. In whether we will design for dominance or for dignity. In whether we will see civilization not as an achievement to display, but as a responsibility to renew. Because only when ethics are placed at the center of power, of progress, of purpose, does a civilization become more than an event. It becomes a message to the future that says, we remembered, we restrained, we aligned, and in that alignment, we found something stronger than empire. We found meaning. Some empires hold people by force, others by fear. But the greatest civilizations endure through something subtler, deeper, an invisible gravity that pulls people toward them, not because they must, but because they believe. This is ethical gravity. It is not imposed. It is invited. It is not enforced. It is embodied. Ethical gravity is what happens when a system becomes so aligned with meaning, so attuned to justice, so resonant with beauty, that it generates its own pull. People follow not out of obligation, but out of orientation. They stay not because they are trapped, but because they are tethered to something they trust, something they recognize as legitimate not only in structure, but in soul. The Persians understood this. Their authority did not rest solely on conquest. It rested on coherence, on the belief that power must be persuasive, not merely punitive. That law must speak to something higher than law itself. That rituals must echo not only tradition, but truth. And so, their empire endured not only in territory, but in temperament. It felt to many not like a cage, but like a constellation, a pattern into which diverse lives could fit. This is what ethical gravity creates, a pattern that holds, a sense that even amidst difference, something binds us, that we are not just coexisting, but co-meaning. In modern times, we've replaced ethical gravity with regulatory control. We build systems that assume distrust, that require enforcement because they lack enchantment. And so, they become brittle, highly functional, but fragile. They do not inspire allegiance. They extract compliance. But compliance is not cohesion, and cohesion is what makes civilizations last. Ethical gravity creates cohesion from within. It does not demand loyalty. It deserves it. It is not loud. It is dependable. And like gravity itself, it becomes most visible when it disappears, when the center no longer holds, and everything begins to drift. We see that drift in our time, in the erosion of public trust, in the spread of cynicism, in the slow unraveling of shared narratives. These are not political problems alone. They are civilizational. They signal the loss of something deeper than policy, the loss of ethical gravity. And that loss cannot be solved with more rules, more speed, more spectacle. It can only be addressed by rebuilding the center, by restoring an inner logic to our systems, a logic that is moral, meaningful, and magnetic. The Persians did this not through slogans, but through structures, through the rhythm of ceremonies, the symbolism of architecture, the pluralism of administration. They created a world where people could feel located, not only on a map, but in a moral universe. And that feeling, that sense of placement, is what held the empire together far longer than force ever could. We need to rediscover this, not to replicate the past, but to understand what made it gravitational. Was it the geometry, the justice, the ritual time? Perhaps it was all of them, woven into a language of belonging that spoke to the soul without needing to shout. That's what our systems now lack. Soul cannot be downloaded. It must be designed into how we speak, how we govern, how we remember. Because people don't leave systems simply because they are unfair. They leave when they stop believing the system can ever be fair. They drift when there is no longer a reason to remain. And they return only when they sense a center worth orbiting. That is the task before us, not just to fix what is broken, but to rebuild what is believable. To shape a world where the good is not only said, but seen. Where justice is not an ideal, but a gravitational force. Where civilization is not a command, but a call. A call we answer not because we are told to, but because somehow we remember how. Ethical gravity is not maintained by power, it is maintained by presence. A presence that whispers, this place makes sense, this system respects me, this rhythm feels just. It is the subtle force that draws individuals toward a shared center, not through coercion, but through coherence. And that coherence emerges when values are not abstract but alive, when justice is not an exception but an atmosphere. The Persians understood this principle centuries ago. Their empire did not rely solely on surveillance or sword. It relied on something quieter, a deep sense that the order they created echoed something eternal. Their laws reflected cosmology. Their rituals marked time with reverence. Their cities were not just functional, they were meaningful. This meaning, repeated in gesture and structure, created ethical gravity. People didn't just obey, they aligned. They felt part of something that made more than demands. It made sense. That is what we are losing today. Our systems are efficient, but increasingly senseless. They tell us what to do, but not why to care. They enforce, but do not inspire. And so we find ourselves drifting, not because we lack tools, but because we lack a center. A moral center that draws us in not through fear, but through resonance. Ethical gravity is that resonance. It is the difference between a rule and a ritual, between a contract and a covenant, between a policy and a purpose. It works not by pushing, but by pulling. And it pulls because it reflects something we long for. Order with meaning, structure with soul. When people believe in the center, they hold themselves accountable. They give more than they are asked. They protect what they cannot profit from. But when the center becomes hollow, even the strongest institutions begin to crack. Fear can hold people temporarily. Incentives can move them conditionally. But only ethical gravity can bind them unconditionally. It is what keeps a society from splintering when crisis comes. It is what keeps strangers acting like stewards. And it cannot be manufactured. It must be cultivated. The Persians cultivated it through form, through rituals that reminded every citizen they were part of something vast, through symbols that echoed across temples, texts, and time, through governance that translated principle into policy but never let the principle disappear. They built ethical gravity into the architecture of life, and it lasted longer than many of their walls. In contrast, our modern world tries to replace gravity with velocity. We accelerate everything, communication, commerce, governance, hoping speed will substitute for solidarity. But speed does not hold people together. If anything, it pulls them apart. Ethical gravity is the opposite of velocity. It is depth. It slows things down just enough to let meaning emerge, just enough to remind us that we are not just consumers, but carriers of something older than ourselves. And that is the key. Ethical gravity is not backward-looking. It is continuity conscious. It says, you belong not because you agree, but because you contribute to the rhythm. You are not here to be managed. You are here to be aligned. This is what civilizations knew that systems forget. That meaning must be embedded, not just communicated. That trust must be grown, not merely promised. And that when people feel held, not trapped, but held, they begin to hold each other. That is the true function of ethical gravity. It turns order into care, and care into culture. So how do we restore it? Not with slogans, not with mandates, but with design. Design that makes meaning visible, law that reflects moral rhythm, education that does not just inform, but form, leadership that listens more than it instructs. We cannot force ethical gravity back into being, but we can create the conditions for it to emerge. And when it does, we may find that the most powerful force in a civilization is not what it builds, but what it draws toward itself. A gravity that does not bind through strength, but through sense, through the quiet pull of a center that deserves to hold. Ethical gravity cannot be legislated, it must be lived. And in a time when institutions feel hollow, when rituals are rushed, when the public sphere is fragmented into noise, it's easy to assume that such gravity is gone for good. But civilizations do not collapse all at once. They unravel, thread by thread, and they can be rewoven, gesture by gesture. Ethical gravity begins wherever meaning is made real. It does not require a throne or temple. It requires intention, repetition, and rhythm. The Persians understood this intuitively. They cultivated gravity not through spectacle, but through structure. Daily acts, seasonal rituals, architectural design that made the sacred visible, language that echoed cosmic proportions. They knew that what is repeated becomes remembered, and what is remembered becomes real. This is the first key to rebuilding ethical gravity in our own time. Restore the rhythm. Not just personal routines, but shared tempos. Times that are set aside not for efficiency, but for reflection. This is not nostalgia. It is design. Because time, left unstructured, becomes tyranny. It scatters the soul. But time given a form, through ritual, celebration, observance, becomes alignment. It creates moments when we are not just individuals, but a community in sync. A moment of silence, a shared meal, a weekly pause. These are not small acts. They are gravitational acts. They slow the drift. They center the dispersed. They remind us that value is not only measured in speed or output, but in coherence. And coherence is the atmosphere in which ethical gravity grows. The second key is space, not just physical, but symbolic. Spaces that carry meaning, that invite care, that say to the body and the spirit, you belong here and how you act here matters. The Persians built such spaces not to control, but to consecrate, to mark that this place, this plaza, this path was part of a larger pattern. Today, we need spaces like that more than ever. Classrooms where learning is not transaction, but transformation. Courts where law does not dominate, but dignify. Markets where exchange is fair, not just fast. These spaces must be shaped, architecturally and ethically, to invite a different way of being. Not passive, but participatory. Not chaotic, but coherent. Third and most essential is speech. Ethical gravity grows where language regains its weight, where words are not thrown, but placed, where truth is not opinion, but orientation. In a world of slogans and spin, the restoration of speech as sacred is revolutionary. The Persians understood this. Their inscriptions were not advertisements. They were affirmations of moral order, carved into stone, not to impress, but to instruct. We must rediscover that mode, a way of speaking that reveals rather than obscures. That calls people not to consume, but to contribute. And that names the good clearly enough to pull people toward it, not by force, but by resonance. These are small beginnings. But all gravity starts small. A center must form before it can attract. And so, the real work of restoring ethical gravity begins not in the halls of power, but in the habits of people. In how we structure a classroom, set a table, welcome a neighbor, hold silence, speak truth. Gravity begins with grace, and grace is contagious. The Persians did not just build empires, they cultivated atmospheres. Atmospheres thick with meaning. And in that thickness, people found direction. We can do the same, not by returning to the past, but by recovering its principles. Rhythm, reverence, responsibility. These are not archaic ideas, they are timeless architectures, and they are waiting to be lived again. One moment, one pattern, one word at a time. Time in a true civilization is not a blank stream. It is a pattern, a structure, a rhythm that teaches more than any book. Civilizational time is not merely about measuring hours. It is about shaping souls. The Persians understood this with quiet brilliance. They did not simply track time, they cultivated it. Through rituals, calendars, feasts, silences. Their year was not a string of identical days. It was a living architecture of meaning. each moment placed where it belonged, each interval echoing cosmic cycles. New Roz was not just a new year. It was a reset of reality, a reminder that life moves not in lines but in spirals, that every return can be renewal. This sense of time did something profound. It gave orientation. People knew not only what day it was, but what kind of day, what was expected of them, what it meant. This is what we have lost in our modern obsession with speed. We have calendars full of events, but empty of essence. We move from task to task with no texture. Our time is flattened, measured in output, not in orientation. And so we feel adrift, busy but unanchored, fast but fragmented. Civilizational time offers a different vision, one where the hours are not consumed but composed, where the week has a rhythm, not just a deadline, where seasons are not just weather, they are wisdom. The Persians wove this wisdom into daily life. Time for planting, time for rest, time for justice, time for worship. Even their architecture followed temporal logic. Sunlight angled to mark solstices, gardens designed to mirror the cycles of growth and decay. They treated time not as a resource to exploit, but as a teacher to trust. And that trust created alignment. Ethical gravity needs this kind of time to root itself, because values do not grow in haste. Meaning does not emerge in motion. It needs pause. It needs return. It needs shared rhythms that tell a people, this is when we remember. This is when we gather. This is when we begin again. What would it mean for us to return to structured time? Not in the sense of more productivity apps or tighter schedules, but in the sense of sacred cadence. Moments that are marked not for profit, but for presence. A weekly rest that is more than leisure. It is a boundary against exhaustion. A season of renewal that invites the whole community to breathe. A yearly threshold that calls us to remember the dead, the land, the stories that shaped us. These structures do not constrain life. They compose it. Like music, they give meaning to silence. Like architecture, they give form to experience. And without them, life collapses into noise. The Persians, like many great civilizations, knew that time is the first temple. If you sanctify time, space will follow. If you structure time with care, people will carry that care into how they eat, speak, build, govern. Time is the moral memory of a culture. It holds its rhythms, its regrets, its hopes. And when we let time become meaningless, when every moment becomes identical, monetized, exhausted, we don't just lose rest. We lose remembrance. We lose the ability to ask, where are we in the story? What is this moment for? What kind of future are we preparing based on how we hold the present? To live with civilizational time is to live with these questions alive. It is to carry a sense that time is not something we pass through, it is something we participate in, something we shape and are shaped by. That shaping begins with the courage to slow down, to mark time again, not just with clocks, but with consciousness, to recover the rituals that restore rhythm, to honor the pauses that prevent collapse, to trust that a civilization that knows how to hold time will never run out of it. Time in a civilization is not a quantity, it is a quality. It is not how much, but how deep. Not how fast, but how formed. Modern life measures time in efficiency. Ancient life measured it in meaning. The Persians knew the difference. They lived not in clock time, but in cosmic time, a time patterned by stars, seasons, silence. Their calendars were not neutral, they were moral instruments. They taught when to act, when to rest, when to remember. Time was not a container for tasks, it was a ceremony. And ceremony turns time into consciousness. It transforms the passing of days into the formation of souls. This is what we have lost. Our time is filled but not formed. We move quickly but forget easily. Without ritual, time becomes flat. Without markers, memory fades. Without return, we lose rhythm. And without rhythm, there is no culture, only chaos. Civilizational time, by contrast, is textured. It repeats but never loops blindly. It returns not to trap us, but to reframe us. The Persians embraced this logic. Their festivals did not merely commemorate events. They recalibrated the soul. Their seasonal rituals aligned the human with the cosmic. Their Sabbaths were not mere pauses. They were proclamations. that rest is not idleness, but identity, that to refuse endless work is to affirm a deeper order. In such a world, time does not demand, it invites. It does not drain, it deepens. And it carries an ethical weight, because how a society structures time reveals what it honors. If every moment is monetized, then only profit matters. If every hour is packed, then reflection disappears. If there is no shared ritual, then there is no shared reality. Ethical gravity cannot survive without temporal gravity. The soul needs sacred time to remember who it is and what it serves. But this sacred time is not something we find. It is something we make. The Persians made it through repetition with reverence. They knew that the soul is shaped by cycles, the return of the sun, the rhythm of fasting and feasting, the cadence of mourning and renewal, each cycle teaching limits, each limit teaching dignity. This kind of Thomish forms character, not just schedule. It cultivates patience, it honors grief, it celebrates joy without consumption, and most importantly, it teaches proportion, because proportion is what turns power into responsibility, and responsibility is what sustains a civilization. The modern world, by contrast, sees time as a line, always moving forward, never looking back. But forward without reflection is not progress, it is momentum. And momentum without meaning becomes collapse. Civilizational time says otherwise. Look back so you can move forward wisely. Mark time so time does not mark you. Pause so purpose can re-enter. This is not about nostalgia, it is about necessity, because only a structured relationship to time allows a society to hold memory, and only memory allows a society to build legacy. Without memory, everything becomes urgency, and in urgency there is no ethics, only reaction. The Persians, by sanctifying time, preserved memory in motion. They passed down not just history, but rhythm, not just stories, but sequences. And in doing so, they kept coherence alive through centuries. What would it take for us to do the same? Not a return to old rituals, but the creation of new ones, crafted with care, rooted in meaning, oriented toward alignment. Time is the first infrastructure of any civilization. If it is sacred, everything else can hold. If it is hollow, nothing will. Because time is not neutral. It is either a path to coherence or a conveyor belt to collapse. And the difference is not in technology, it is in intention. To live in civilizational time is to reclaim intention, to shape hours into harmony, to move not just forward, but inward, to let time become teacher, and in doing so, let civilization become soul. Time, when structured wisely, becomes an architecture of ethics. It is not simply the background of civilization, it is its invisible framework. Just as buildings shape how we move through space, time shapes how we move through meaning. In every enduring culture, time is treated not as a commodity, but as a covenant, a sacred agreement between generations. The Persians understood this with uncommon depth. Their calendar was not just practical, it was philosophical. It taught balance between light and dark, labor and rest, memory and renewal. They wove moral order into the very flow of days, turning the year into a school of the soul. Each season had a lesson, each celebration had a weight, each pause had a purpose. This was not superstition, it was design. A design that taught people how to live with limits, how to locate themselves in a story larger than appetite or urgency. And this design created more than stability, it created coherence. Because time, when aligned with meaning, becomes a mirror. It shows a society what it truly values. In our modern world, that mirror has cracked. Time has become abstract, measured, monetized, mechanized. We fill it with noise, strip it of ritual, slice it into deadlines. And in doing so, we lose not only rhythm, we lose reverence. Time is now either used or wasted, but rarely held, rarely honored. And so we drift. Without shared rituals, we lose shared reference. Without sacred time, we forget sacred tasks. Ethical gravity cannot survive this forgetting. For moral memory to endure, time must carry it, not just through history books, but through repetition, through rhythm, through ritual that does not explain but enacts. The Persians practiced this with elegance. They built moments that told stories without speaking. Time itself became text, written in feast and fast, in planting and harvest, in silence and song. This layering of meaning made time feel inhabited, not just by the present, but by the presence of something larger, ancestral, cosmic, eternal. Civilizational time, in this sense, is not about nostalgia. It is about orientation. It tells people where they are, not just on a clock, but in a covenant. It reminds them what came before and what ought to come next. And most importantly, it teaches them how to hold tension between now and forever, between freedom and form. Our culture, by contrast, treats time as a stage for productivity. But without sacred interruption, productivity becomes pathology. We race through days without digestion. We scroll through years without sense. And the result is not freedom, it is fatigue. Civilization collapses not only when walls fall, but when rhythms break. When time becomes weightless, the soul does too. To rebuild ethical gravity, we must re-sanctify time. We must carve out moments that are untouchable, not because they are efficient, but because they are essential. Not because they serve profit, but because they serve presence. This does not mean returning to the past. It means recovering what the past knew. That time is a temple and rituals are its architecture. That how we structure time shapes how we see truth. If every hour is identical, nothing is important. If nothing is important, then nothing is protected. And if nothing is protected, then nothing will endure. The Persians protected meaning by embedding it in time. They knew that laws may fade, buildings may crumble, but a rhythm, if lived deeply enough, can survive even ruin. What then are the rhythms we must now create? What feasts, fasts, pauses, or prayers will carry our values forward? Not as ideas, but as habits. The answer will not come from algorithms. It will come from attention. Attention to the soul's need for pattern, to the community's need for pause, to the civilization's need for center. Time is not neutral. It either numbs or nourishes. The choice is ours, to let it slip past unnoticed, or to shape it until it shapes us in return. Symbols are not decorations, they are declarations. Silent, yes, but never empty. In every true civilization, symbols speak. They speak without words, yet say more than speeches. They hold not only meaning but memory, not only culture but continuity. The Persians understood this power deeply. Their empire was not stitched together by force alone. It was held by a shared symbolic grammar. A lotus carved into stone, a lion beside a sun, a flame that never died. These were not ornaments, they were orientation points, anchors of identity. They reminded the people, regardless of region or language, that they belonged to something more than a system. They belonged to a story. This is the genius of symbols. They do not argue, they resonate. They bypass the intellect and speak directly to the soul. And what they say is this: you are not alone. You are part of something longer, deeper, and greater than yourself. This is what we have lost in the modern world. Surrounded by images, we have forgotten the symbolic. We confuse branding with belonging. We substitute logos for meaning, but a civilization that forgets how to symbolize forgets how to remember. Because symbols are memory made visible. They allow values to be felt, not just taught. They carry moral weight without shouting. The gateway to Persepolis does not explain itself, but it elevates. It dignifies. It invites awe. That awe is not aesthetic. It is ethical. Because symbols shape behavior. They set a tone. A flag, a temple, a public square. They form a backdrop that teaches people how to be without telling them what to do. This is the subtlety of civilizational design. The Persians mastered it. They knew that governance is not just about rules. It is about rhythm. And rhythm is maintained through form, through beauty that speaks of balance, through proportion that hints at justice, through icons that remind us of what cannot be quantified, but must never be forgotten. Today, we live amidst fragmentation. Our public spaces are functional, but not formative. Our images are fast, but not foundational. We scroll past thousands of pictures, but retain none. Why? Because symbols require stillness. They require reverence. And we have traded both for velocity. But a society without symbols is a society without shared imagination. And without shared imagination, there can be no shared identity. Civilizations endure not because of what they control, but because of what they inspire. And inspiration needs form. It needs to be seen, touched, carried. The Persians placed symbols not just in palaces, but in ordinary places, on coins, on seals, on architecture that faced the rising sun. Everywhere, a reminder. You are in a world of meaning. You are held by design. That is the quiet work of symbolic architecture. It holds without holding down. It teaches without lecturing. It encodes dignity into the visual field. And from that encoding, culture emerges. We must ask ourselves, what symbols hold us today? What do our cities say? What do our buildings bless? What do our monuments mean? And what happens when there are no answers? When the physical world stops reminding us of the moral one? We drift. We forget. We disintegrate. That is why rebuilding ethical gravity requires not only time, but texture. Not only values, but vessels. Symbols are those vessels, and they do not need to be grand. A simple gesture, a shared emblem, a space of silence, a threshold that demands we lower our voices. These are civilizational acts. They say, something matters here, something endures here, something speaks here, even when no one is speaking. Let us then recover the symbolic, not for nostalgia, but for necessity. Not to return to the past, but to remember how the past held itself together. Through fire, through stone, through image, through silence, because in the end, every great civilization is a language, and symbols are its alphabet. Without them, we forget how to read who we are. There are places that speak without sound, places that do not just shelter, but shape. These are sacred spaces, not necessarily religious, but always reverent. They hold a quality of presence, a sense that something larger than logic is at work. In every great civilization, such spaces were not accidents. They were achievements. The Persians built them with care. Their temples, gardens, courts, and ceremonial halls were not only architectural feats, they were emotional landscapes. Entering them was not a transaction. It was a transformation. The light shifted, the silence deepened, the proportions aligned, and in that subtle choreography, something shifted inside the soul. This is the genius of sacred space. It does not command, it invites. It does not impose, it attunes. It takes the scattered human and gathers them into a posture of presence, a slower breath, a lowered voice, a heightened sense of being. These effects are not mystical, they are intentional. Sacred spaces are designed to realign us with time, with meaning, with each other. The Persians knew this. Their spaces echoed cosmic principles. The axis of light, the symmetry of walls, the rhythm of pillars, all meant to reflect a deeper order. Not to overwhelm the human, but to elevate it, to place them in a moral architecture where even stone could speak of justice, balance, and awe. Today, our public spaces rarely do this. They are built for flow, not formation, for access, not atmosphere. We prioritize openness, but forget orientation. We seek efficiency, but lose elevation. And so our spaces become hollow. They may function, but they do not form us. They do not hold us long enough to change us. Sacred space does the opposite. It slows us down. It frames our attention. It reminds us that we are more than what we produce, that there are places where the soul still speaks and must be heard. The Persians placed these spaces at the heart of their civilization, not to escape life, but to sanctify it. Gardens arranged like paradise, not as luxury, but as living metaphor. Fire temples where light was not worshipped, but witnessed, as symbol of purity, of constancy, of inner flame. In these spaces, even the air felt different, not because of belief, but because of design. Sacred space works not only through symbol, but through sequence. The approach, the threshold, the interior. Each step guiding the body into new states of awareness. This is why it matters where the light falls. Why it matters how sound echoes. Why it matters that some doors ask us to bow. These are not aesthetic choices. They are ethical ones, because how a space holds us shapes how we hold each other. If we are always rushing, always exposed, always stimulated, then reverence becomes rare. And without reverence, community becomes thin. Sacred space teaches reverence not by rule but by rhythm, and that rhythm becomes part of the culture. It affects how we gather, how we speak, how we remember. Without sacred space, ethical gravity weakens, because there is no place where the values are embodied, no place where silence is allowed to teach, no place where attention becomes alignment. The loss of such spaces is not just aesthetic, it is civilizational. It signals a deeper amnesia that we have forgotten how to build places that teach us how to be. But we can remember. We can recover the art of shaping space with meaning. It begins not with grand cathedrals, but with intention. A quiet room, a public bench that invites stillness, a doorway that invites reflection. These are acts of civilizational design. They say something matters here, not because of what we do, but because of how we are. The Persians built with this in mind, not only to impress, but to impress upon. Their spaces told stories, not with words, but with weight, a weight that centered the soul. We need that weight again, in our homes, in our cities, in our rituals, not to go back, but to go deeper, because without sacred space, meaning has nowhere to land. And without places of meaning, even the loudest truths go unheard. Memory does not live only in the mind. It lives in matter, in stone, in wood, in the curve of an arch, or the shadow of a pillar. In every great civilization, memory was not left to chance. It was carved, composed, and consecrated into form. The Persians knew this. Their symbols were not simply decorative. They were mnemonic. Every image, every threshold, every ritual object was a container of collective memory. These were not static artifacts. They were dynamic vessels designed to remember when people forget. And people always forget, especially in times of speed, rupture, or abundance. That is why civilizations encode memory into the visible world. Not because they fear forgetting, but because they know it is inevitable. So they build against it. They make memory harder to erase. This is what we have lost. In our cities, in our homes, in our rituals, memory has become optional. We outsource it to devices. We file it in clouds. But memory without form is fragile. It can be edited, erased, ignored. Civilizational memory, by contrast, has form. It stands in the open. It greets us without needing to explain. It says simply, remember. And in that remembering, we become part of something longer than our own lives. The Persians made this visceral. A relief on a palace wall was not just political, it was pedagogical. It taught virtues. It preserved victories. It showed what kind of order they wished to project and protect. The layout of cities reflected hierarchy, harmony, and hospitality. Even their gardens were archives of worldview, balance, boundary, beauty. These forms were not neutral. They were narrative. They told stories that words alone could not hold. Today we are drowning in data but starving for memory. We confuse information with inheritance. But only memory passed through form becomes inheritance, because only then does it have weight. A child does not inherit history by reading it. They inherit it by walking through it, by seeing a place, a pattern, a practice that holds meaning. That says, this mattered. This still matters. Without such anchors, culture becomes vapor. Traditions lose traction, ethics lose context, and eventually we forget not just what happened, but why it mattered. That is the crisis of modern space. It no longer remembers for us. Our buildings are blank. Our public squares forget. Our monuments often speak only of power, not of principle. The result? We become dislocated, not just from place, but from purpose. Sacred memory collapses into spectacle. Historical depth becomes surface noise. And ethical gravity fades because gravity requires weight, and weight requires continuity. The Persians ensured continuity through beauty that bore memory. Not beauty for admiration, but beauty for alignment. They knew that memory is not static. It is rhythmic. It must be renewed, relived, reinscribed. Their rituals did this. Their objects did this. Their structures did this. They gave people places where remembering was inevitable, not because of obligation, but because of presence. What might it mean for us to rebuild such places? Not replicas of the past, but forms that speak to the soul. Walls that carry memory, objects that invite pause, symbols that do not explain but evoke. These are not luxuries. They are necessities. Because without visible memory, civilization becomes forgettable. And forgettable civilizations do not endure. To recover civilizational intelligence, we must remember how to remember. We must turn memory back into material. Let it shape our streets, our ceremonies, our daily gestures, because memory held in space becomes culture, and culture held in memory becomes continuity. That is the task, to remember aloud, to let our surroundings speak what our tongues may forget, to live among forms that do not let us drift too far from what matters. The Persians gave us this example, not to copy but to continue. Their cities were libraries of meaning, their symbols, syllables of a language older than speech. And their legacy is not merely in what they left behind, but in what they embedded so deeply, it still speaks, even in silence. A civilization does not endure through knowledge alone. It endures through how it expresses that knowledge, through form, through rhythm, through memory that is made visible, touchable, livable. This is expressive intelligence, the ability of a culture to give shape to its soul, to turn abstract values into concrete patterns, to turn ethics into architecture. The Persians were masters of this intelligence. Their wisdom was not just spoken, it was spatial. Their justice not only codified, it was carved. Their vision of harmony did not remain in poems. It bloomed in gardens, echoed in rituals, whispered through light and shadow. This was not style, it was structure. They understood that form is not decoration, it is destiny. Because how we shape our world shapes how we think, how we feel, how we live. Expressive intelligence is what allows a civilization to speak beyond words, to carry coherence across generations, not just through law, but through living form. It is the ability to teach without instruction, to bind without coercion, to inspire without explanation. And it is fading from our world. Today we know more than ever, but express less deeply. We can calculate, replicate, optimize, but struggle to symbolize. We fill space with data, but not direction. We create interfaces, but not intimacy. And so, even surrounded by information, we feel starved for meaning. That starvation is not intellectual, it is expressive. We are not hungry for more knowledge. We are hungry for knowledge that speaks, that sings, that slows us down and draws us in. The Persians gave knowledge a body. They gave belief a boundary. They gave memory a rhythm. And in doing so, they built more than empire. They built ethos, an ethos that could be felt, not just followed. That could be sensed, not just said. This is what expressive intelligence does. It turns civilization into a sensorial experience. It allows values to be lived before they are understood. It bridges the gap between knowing and becoming. Without it, societies become brittle. Their truths remain abstract, unanchored, unaffecting. Their citizens become informed, but not formed. And formation is what sustains a people, not just data. This is why expressive intelligence is not artistic flourish. It is civilizational necessity. It is what allows continuity without coercion. It creates spaces that teach, symbols that stabilize, rituals that realign. And all of these speak to the body before the brain. They remind us what matters not by explaining, but by embedding. The Persians embedded order into proportion. They encoded balance into design. Their cities taught discipline. Their temples taught wonder. Their ceremonies taught restraint. These were not didactic tools. They were expressive technologies. They shaped character without command. Today we must ask, what are we expressing? What do our buildings, our screens, our rituals say? Do they elevate or exhaust? Do they clarify or clutter? Do they teach us how to be or merely distract us from who we are? Because a civilization that cannot express itself with depth will eventually forget itself in noise. To recover expressive intelligence, we must become designers of coherence. We must shape time, space, image, and language with the same care we give to strategy or policy. Because only through form can values become forces. Only through expression can meaning become memory. This is not about going backwards. It is about going deeper. The Persians remind us that every civilization is not only what it believes, but how it embodies that belief in stone, in silence, in ceremony, in story. They spoke in structures, and their structures still speak. Not because they survived intact, but because they express something intact, an inner logic, an ethical rhythm, a vision of the world made visible. That is the legacy of expressive intelligence, and that is the path forward. Not more speech, but deeper expression. Not more symbols, but symbols that speak. Not louder voices, but wiser forms. Because in the end, what endures is not only what we know, but what we shape in such a way that it continues to speak long after we are gone. Silence is not the absence of sound. It is the presence of depth. In every true civilization, silence was not a gap between things. It was a thing, a structure, a signal, a space that taught as much as any speech, that shaped as much as any law. The Persians understood this. Their rituals were not loud. Their temples echoed with stillness. Their architecture invited pause, not performance. Because they knew, where there is no silence, there can be no soul. Silence is what gives shape to meaning, like space between notes gives birth to music. Without it, everything blurs into noise. And noise, however informative, cannot form a human being. Expressive intelligence reaches its highest form not in grandeur, but in restraint. The ability to stop, to hold, to wait. The power to let emptiness speak. This is the paradox of all enduring wisdom. It does not need to shout. It creates space and trusts that space to speak. Today, we fear silence. We fill every moment, every room, every screen, every pocket of stillness is invaded by sound, motion, message. We are terrified of the unscripted pause, the unanswered question, and in this flood of expression, we drown meaning itself. The Persians remind us, silence is not emptiness, it is essence. It is where gravity lives, where awe emerges, where alignment happens not by command, but by presence. In sacred spaces, silence was the teacher. It taught proportion. It taught humility. It reminded the powerful that not all things can be spoken, that some truths must be held, that some names must be whispered or not spoken at all. This was not repression. It was reverence. Silence made room for mystery, and mystery, in turn, made room for moral imagination. Without silence, nothing settles. No memory can take root. No ritual can resonate. No form can carry meaning beyond itself. That is why every great civilization had spaces designed not only to gather but to still, thresholds that slowed the body, courtyards that calmed the breath, moments in a ceremony where nothing was said, yet everything was understood. These are not aesthetic gestures. They are epistemological. They shape how we know, not just what we know, because silence is not just what happens when we stop talking. It is what allows us to truly hear. The self, the other, the eternal. A civilization without silence is a civilization without self-awareness. It reacts but cannot reflect. It produces but cannot perceive. It performs but cannot pause. And so, even as it expands in size and power, it shrinks in soul. The Persians resisted this shrinkage by sanctifying silence. Their fire temples were filled with quiet, not because they lacked activity, but because they understood the moral architecture of stillness. Light flickered, breath slowed, time changed texture, and in that shift, people re-entered alignment. This is what we need now. Not more noise, not more answers, but spaces where the unanswered is welcome, where pause is protected, where we relearn the grammar of being human, not through performance, but through presence. Silence is the only place where the self can meet the true. And only in that meeting can civilization be renewed. Not with slogans, not with systems, but with stillness that holds truth long enough for it to reshape us. The greatest wisdoms are born not in frenzy, but in silence. The greatest acts of healing begin not in motion, but in rest. And the most powerful civilizations were those that gave silence a place, not only in ritual, but in rhythm. We must now become a civilization that dares to stop, that designs for stillness, that understands silence not as absence, but as a gift, a form of care, a sign of depth, a signal that we are still listening for something larger than ourselves. And in that listening, we may find the voice of civilization once again. A civilization is not born when people build. It is born when people center. Not when they conquer land, but when they compose meaning. Not when they multiply wealth, but when they align around what is worthy. The Persians knew this. They built with stone, yes, but they built first with stillness, with silence, with structure that held more than function. It held philosophy. They did not begin with empire. They began with axis, a sense of where the center lies. And from that center, all things flowed: time, law, ritual, rhythm, reverence. This is what we must remember, that civilization is not a product of progress. It is a discipline of depth, a choreography of coherence, a decision to make the invisible visible, to shape time with intention, to inscribe memory into matter, to turn values into vessels. The greatness of the Persians was not in how far they reached, but in how deeply they rooted. They understood that power without poise collapses, that speed without stillness blinds, that knowledge without form evaporates. So they carved form into being. They designed silence into space. They aligned human motion with cosmic rhythm. They gave architecture the dignity of ethics and gave ethics the texture of ritual. And because they centered so carefully, they endured so profoundly. Today, we are losing our center. We build more than ever, but anchor less. We connect faster, but cohere less. We express constantly, but remember little. We are loud, yet forget the language of stillness. We are seen, yet fear that nothing we build will be truly held. That fear is not unfounded, because without a center, there is no gravity. And without gravity, nothing holds. Not culture, not conscience, not community. This is why civilizations fall, not in fire, but in forgetting. Not because of invasion, but because the center fades. The rhythms break, the spaces forget how to teach, the symbols forget how to speak. And when that happens, all that remains is momentum without meaning. But forgetting is not final, because remembering is a choice, and we can choose again. To remember that depth is not delay, it is direction. That rhythm is not rigidity, it is resonance. That silence is not weakness, it is wisdom. We can choose to become not just a society of systems, but a civilization of sense. A people who design not only for survival, but for soul. Who structure not only for speed, but for sacredness. Who hold memory not only in cloud, but in ceremony. This is not romantic, it is responsible. Because a civilization that forgets how to hold itself cannot hold anything else. Not justice, not peace, not future. To hold the future, we must first hold the center. And the center is not a place, it is a pattern. A way of moving through time that honors its weight. A way of building space that remembers its source. A way of using speech that protects silence. A way of expressing power that bows before meaning. The Persians, like all great civilizations, understood this. Their greatest achievement was not military, it was moral. Not what they built, but what they believed could be built. A world where form teaches, where rhythm restores, where silence speaks, and where memory is more than nostalgia, it is a nourishment. That possibility still stands. Not in monuments, but in moments. Moments when we choose meaning over motion, alignment over ambition, coherence over chaos. These moments are seeds, and enough seeds become structure. Enough structure becomes culture. And culture, lived deeply enough, becomes gravity. The kind that does not crush, but calls. The kind that does not bind, but holds. The kind that says, here is the center, walk from here, build from here, return here when the noise becomes too much. For this is where civilizations are not only remembered, but reborn. And if something in you stirred along this journey, if a part of you remembered something older than memory, deeper than thought, then don't stop here. This is not an ending. This is a threshold. What you've seen is only the first chamber of a much larger archive. In the next parts of this series, we go further into lost rituals, moral technologies, forgotten architectures of wisdom. So stay with us. Keep walking. The path of a civilization does not end in its past. It begins when you choose to carry it forward.